Chapter 19 of The Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cornet of Horse by G.A. Henty. Chapter 19. The Evasion. Upon the ride from Versailles to Paris, Rupert told the Marquis what he had done and heard. "It is bad news, Rupert. I will ride back this afternoon, when I have lodged you in Paris, and see Adele. If she objects, as I know she will object to this marriage, I shall respectfully protest. That any good will come of the protest I have no thought, but my protest may strengthen Adele's refusal by showing that she has her father's approval. Adele will of course be treated coldly at first. Then she will have pressure put upon her, then be ordered to choose between a convent and marriage. She will choose the convent. Now, in some convents she could live quietly and happily, in others she would be persecuted. If she is sent to a convent chosen for her, it will be worse than a prison. Her life will be made a burden to her until she consents to obey the king's command. Therefore, my object will be to secure her retreat to a convent where she will be well treated and happy. But we will talk of this again." It was not until the following afternoon that the Marquis returned from Versailles. "I am off to the front again," he said. "I had an audience with His Majesty this morning, and respectfully informed him of my daughter's incurable repugnance to the Duke de Carolon, and of her desire to remain single until at least she reached the age of 20. His Majesty was pleased to say that girls' whims were matters to which it behoved not to pay any attention. He said, however, that for the present he would allow it to remain in abeyance, and that he begged me to see Adele and to urge upon her the necessity for making up her mind to accept His Majesty's choice. He also said that the news from the army was bad, that good officers were urgently required there, and that it would be therefore advisable for me to repair at once to the front again, and take the command of my regiment. He said that he wished me to take you with me as far as Lille, and that you should there take up your residence." "Of course I will accompany you, sir," Rupert said, "but I will withdraw my parole as soon as you hand me over, and take my chance of escaping." "Yes, I should do that, Rupert. Indeed, as you gave your parole to me, you can give it back to me now if you choose. I will run the risk of some little anger on the part of the king, if you quit me on your way to Lille and make the best of your way to the frontier." "No, thank you," Rupert said. "There can't be much difficulty in escaping from a town when one wants to do so. And it would do you an evil turn indeed to incense the king against you at the present time." The next morning, just as they were setting out, a lackey placed a note in Rupert's hands. "I hear you are sent off to Lille. I have a cousin there, and have written to recommend you to his care. I will keep my promise and let you know, if needs be, of what is happening to the young person we spoke of. Diana." Rupert wrote a few words of earnest thanks, and, imitating the example set him, gave it unaddressed and unsigned to the lackey, with a handsome present to himself. On the way to Lille, the Marquis told Rupert his plans for the withdrawal of Adele from court, and her concealment, should Louis insist on the marriage being pressed on. Arriving at Lille, Rupert was handed over to the governor, and, having formally withdrawn his parole to make no effort to escape, he was assigned quarters in barracks, whence he was allowed to go into the town during daylight, being obliged, however, to attend a roll call at midday. The fortifications of the town were so strong and well guarded that it was supposed that the chance of escape was small. The following day the Marquis de Pignerol took an affectionate leave of Rupert, and went on to join the army, and an hour or two later Captain Louis de Tamp, the cousin of whom Diana had written, called upon him and placed himself at his service. His cousin had told him of the supposed crime for which Rupert had been sent away from court, and felt much sympathy with what she considered his hard treatment. Not only Louis d'Etampes, but the French officers of the garrison showed great kindness and attention to the English prisoner, for the Duke of Marlborough had treated the French officers who fell into his hands at Ramillies with such kindness and courtesy that the French were glad to have an opportunity of reciprocating the treatment when the chance fell in their way. Late in the autumn, the Marquis de Pignerol was brought back to Lille, seriously wounded in one of the last skirmishes of the campaign. Rupert spent all the time he was allowed to be out of barracks at his friend's quarters. The wound was not considered dangerous, but it would keep the Marquis a prisoner to his room for weeks. A few days after the Marquis was brought in, Louis d'Etampes came into Rupert's room early in the morning. "I have a note for you from my fair cousin," he said. "It must be something particular, for she has sent a special messenger with a letter to me, and on opening it, I find only a line asking me to give you the enclosed instantly." Rupert opened the letter from Diana d'Etampes. It was as follows: "Adele has been ordered to marry the Duke de Carolon on the 15th. Unless she consents, she is on the 14th to be sent to the nunnery of Sainte Marie, the strictest in France, where they will somehow or other wring consent from her before many weeks are over. They have done so in scores of cases like hers. I promised to tell you, and I have done so, but I don't see that anything can be done. I hear Monsieur le Marquis is badly wounded, but even were he here, he could do nothing. The king is resolute. The Duke de Carolon has just given 200,000 crowns toward the expenses of the war." "May I see?" Louis d'Etampes said, for the young men were now fast friends. Rupert handed him the note. "What can you do, my poor boy?" he said. "I will go and see the Marquis and let you know afterwards," Rupert said. "I shall do something, you may be sure." "If you do, you will want to escape from Lille. I will see about the arrangements for that. There is no time to be lost. It is the 10th today." Rupert's conversation with the Marquis de Pignerol was long and interesting. The Marquis chafed at being confined to a sick-bed and permitting Rupert to run the risk, which was immense, of the attempt alone. However, as he could not move, and as Rupert was determined to do something, the Marquis entered into all the plans he had drawn up and intended to follow when such an emergency occurred. He gave him a letter for Adele, and then they parted. At his room, Rupert found Louis. "Quick," he said. "There is no time to lose. At 10 o'clock a convoy of wounded leave for Paris. The doctor in charge is a friend of mine, and a capital fellow. I have just seen him. All is arranged. Come along to my quarters. They are on the line that the convoy goes to the gate. Jump in bed, then I will bandage up your head with plasters, so that not more than space to see and breathe out of will be left. When the convoy arrives at the door, he will have an empty litter ready, will bring up 4 men who will lift you in, supposing you to be a wounded French officer, carry you down, and off you go with the convoy, not a soul save the doctor, you, and I, the wiser. He has got a pass to leave the city with 48 sick and 10 soldiers, and he has only to tell one of those marked to go that he is not well enough to be moved, and will go with the next convoy. The messenger who brought the letter has started again, and has taken with him a led horse of mine. He will be at the hostelry of Henri IV, at the place where you will stop tonight. He will not know who you are. I have told him that a friend of mine will call for the horse, which I had promised to send him. When you halt for the night, the doctor will order you to be carried into his own room. You will find 2 or 3 suits of clothes in the litter. a lackey's suit of our livery, which may be useful, a country gentleman's, and one of mine. When you are alone with the doctor, and all is safe, get up, put on the country gentleman's suit, say good-bye to him, and go straight to the stables at the Henri IV. You are the Sire de Nadar. I have written a note here, telling you the horse will be there, and you are to fetch it. Here it is. The messenger will know my seal." "I am indeed obliged to you," Rupert said. "You have thought of everything. But how will the doctor explain my not being forthcoming in the morning?" "Oh, he will arrange that easily enough. The soldiers will all sleep soundly enough after this march. Besides, they will not, in all probability, be near his quarters, so he will only have to say that he found you were too ill to continue the journey, and had, therefore, had you carried to a confrère of his. You must be under no fear, Rupert, of any evil consequences to anyone, for no one will ever connect you with the convoy. You will be missed at roll call, but that will go for nothing. When you are absent again at 6 o'clock, you will be reported as missing. Then it will be supposed that you are hid in the city, and a sharp watch will be set at the gates. But after a few days it will be supposed that you have either got over the walls, or that you have gone out disguised as a peasant. A prisoner of war, more or less, makes but little difference, and there will never be any fuss about it." Soon after dusk, on the evening of the 13th of October, Adele de Pignerol was sitting alone in a large room in the house of Madame de Soissons. A wood fire was blazing, and even in that doubtful light it might have been seen that the girl's eyes were swollen with crying. She was not crying now, but was looking into the fire with a set, determined look in her face. "I don't care," she said. "They may kill me at Saint Marie, but I will never say yes. Oh, if Papa were but here!" At that moment there was a knock at the door, and a bright-looking waiting-maid entered. "A note, mademoiselle, from Mademoiselle d'Etampes, and mademoiselle," and she put her finger mysteriously to her lips. "It is a new lackey has brought it. I told him to come again in 10 minutes for an answer, for I thought it better he should not come in to be looked at by Francois and Jules." "Why not, Margot?" Adele asked in great surprise. "Because, mademoiselle, he seemed to me, I may be wrong, you know, but he seemed to me very like—" "Like whom, Margot? How mysterious you are!" "Like the English officer," Margot said, with an arch nod. Adele leapt to her feet. "You must be mad, Margot! There, light a candle." But without waiting, Adele knelt down close to the fire and broke open the letter. A flush, even ruddier than that given by the fire, mounted over her face. "It is him, Margot. He has come from my father. Now we are to do what I told you about. We are to go off tonight under his charge to your mother's, my dear old nurse, and there I am to live with you and be as your cousin till Papa can get me out of the country." "And is the young officer to live there till the Marquis comes?" Margot asked slyly. "He might pass as another cousin, mademoiselle." "How foolish you are, Margot, and this is no time for folly. But listen, my father says Rupert will be in the street round the corner with 3 horses at 11 o'clock. You and Margot are to be dressed in the boys' clothes that I bade you prepare. Take in bundles 2 of Margot's dresses. Do not be afraid to trust yourself with Rupert Holiday. Regard him as a brother. He has all my confidence and trust." "We must remember that," Margot said. "Remember what, Margot?" "Only that you are to regard him as a brother, mademoiselle." Margot, I am surprised at you, joking like a child when we have a terrible business before us. But indeed I feel so happy at the thought of escape from that terrible convent that I could joke like a child also." "You had better write a line for him, mademoiselle. It was from chance that I happened to be in the hall when he rang, and we don't want him to come in to be stared at by Francois while you write an answer." Quickly Adele sat down at a table and wrote, "At the hour and place named, expect us. Yours trustfully, Adele." As the clock struck 11, two slight figures stole noiselessly out of the garden gate of Madame de Soissons' house at Versailles. The town was hushed in sleep, and not a sound was moving in the street. They carried bundles with them, and walked with rapid steps to a small lane which led off the street by the side of the garden wall. It was quite dark, and they could see nothing, but a voice said, "Adele!" "Rupert," one of the figures answered in shy, trembling tones. "Please stay where you are," Rupert said. "It is lighter in the street." The horses were led forth noiselessly, for Rupert had fastened cloths round their feet to prevent the iron shoes sounding on the round pebbles which paved the streets. Not a word was said. There was a warm clasp of the hand, and Rupert lifted Adele into the saddle. Margot climbed into another, and the three rode rapidly down the streets. Not a word was spoken until they were in the open country. "Thank God you are safe thus far, Adele. The last time I helped you onto a horse was the day you went out to see my hawk kill a heron." "Oh, Rupert," the girl said, "it seems like a dream. But please do not let us talk about ourselves. Tell me about Papa. How is he?" Rupert told her, and gradually as they talked, the excitement and agitation passed off. "And where did you get the horses, Rupert?" "The one I am riding is Louis de Tampes," he said. "The others are your father's. I brought orders from him to his steward in Paris that 2 of his best horses were to be sent this morning to a stable in Versailles and left there, and that a person with an order from him would call for them." "I cannot see you in the least. Are you dressed as Monsieur de Tampes' lackey still?" "No, I am now a quiet country gentleman, riding down from Paris with my 2 sons, who have been up with me to see their aunt, who lives in the Rue de Tampes." "Talk French, please, Rupert. Margot will understand then, and she is so brave and good, and shares my danger, so she ought to be as one of us." Adele's spirits rose as they got further from Versailles, and they talked and laughed cheerfully, but in low tones. 3 miles from Versailles, as they rode past a crossroad, 2 mounted men dashed out suddenly.
"Stand in the king's name. Who are you?"
"We are travelers," Rupert said quietly, "and go where we will. Who are you?"
"We are guards of the court, and we must know who you are before we suffer you to pass. None ride at night near Versailles but with a pass."
"I am an exception then," Rupert said, "and I advise you not to interfere with us." And he urged his horse a few feet in advance of his companions. One of the horsemen seized his bridle, while another drew a pistol. Rupert's sword leaped from its scabbard and cut down the man who held the rein. The other fired, but Rupert threw himself forward on the horse's neck, and the bullet whizzed over his head. He rode at the guard, and with a heavy blow with the pommel of his sword, struck him senseless from his horse. "Now," he said to Adele, "we can ride again. You are not frightened, I hope?" "Not so frightened as I was the first time you drew sword in my behalf," the girl said, "but it is very dreadful. Are they killed, Rupert?" "Not a bit of it," Rupert said. "One has got a gash on the head which will cost him a crown in plaster. The other may have lost some teeth. It would have been wise to have killed them, for their tale in the morning is likely to be regarded as throwing some light upon your disappearance. But I could not kill men who were only doing their duty. At any rate, we have 12 hours' start, even if they take up the clue and pursue us on this line tomorrow. It is about 10 miles this side of Poitiers that your mother lives, is it not, Margot?" "Yes, Monsieur Rupert. How surprised she will be at my arrival with my cousins." "Oh, we are both your cousins, are we, Margot?" "Mademoiselle Adele is to pass as my cousin, monsieur, and I suppose you must be either another cousin or else her brother." "Margot," Adele said. "You chatter too much." "Do I, mademoiselle? It is better than riding through the darkness without speaking. I was very glad when the cloths were off the horses' feet, for we seemed like a party of ghosts." "How long shall we be getting there?" Adele asked presently. 6 days, if we do it all with the same horses," Rupert said. "And I am afraid to hire horses and leave them on the way, as it would look as if we were pressed for time. No, for today we are safe, but for today only. Messengers will be sent in all directions with orders for our arrest. They will take fresh relays of horses, and really our only hope is in disguise. I propose that we go the first stage without halting as far as our horses will carry us. I think we can get to Orléans. There we will put them up and take rooms. Then Margot must slip out in her own dress and buy 2 peasant girls' attire, and I will pick up at some dealer in old clothes a suit which will enable me to pass as a wounded soldier making his way home. Then we will strike off from the main road and get on some other road. They will inquire all along the road and will hear of a gentleman and 2 youths, and will for a while have that in their minds. No one will particularly notice us, and we shall get through into Tours safely enough. We must never enter a house or town together, for they will be on the lookout for 3 people, and neither a soldier with his head bound up nor 2 peasant girls will attract attention. At Tours I will get a farmer's dress, and will buy a horse and cart and a load of hay, and will pick you up outside the town. You can get on the hay and can cover yourselves over if you see any horsemen in pursuit. After that it will be all easy work." "Why could you not get the cart at Orléans, Rupert?" Adele asked. "I might," he said, "but I think that the extra change would be best, as they would then have no clue whatever to follow. They will trace us to Orléans, and you may be sure that there will be a hot hue and cry, and it may be that the fact of a horse and a cart having been sold would come out. They will not know whether we have made east, west, or south from there, so there will be a far less active search at Tours than there will be at Orléans." So the journey was carried out, and without any serious adventure, although a great many slight alarms and some narrow escapes of detection, which cannot be here detailed. The party arrived at the spot where the lane leading to the little farm occupied by Margot's mother left the main road. Here they parted, the girls taking their bundles and starting to trudge the last few miles on foot. Margot discreetly went on a little ahead to give her mistress the opportunity of speaking to Rupert alone. But she need not have done so, for all that Rupert said was, "I have been in the light of your brother this time, Adele, as your father gave you into my charge. If I ever come again, dear, it will be different." "You are very good, Rupert. Goodbye." And with a wave of the hand, she ran after Margot, while Rupert, mounting the cart, drove on into Poitiers. Here he sold his load of hay to a stable-keeper, drove a mile or 2 out of the town, entered a wood, and then took the horse out of the cart, and leaving the latter in a spot where, according to all appearances, it was not likely to be seen for months, drove the horse still further into the wood, and, placing a pistol to its head, shot it dead. Then he renewed his disguise as a soldier, but this time dispensed with the greater part of his bandages, and set out on his return, in high spirits at having so successfully performed his journey. He pursued his journey as far back as Blois, without the slightest interruption, but here his tramp came to a sudden termination. Secure in the excellence of his French, Rupert had attempted no disguise as to his face, beyond such as was given by a strip of plaster running from the upper lip to the temple. He strode gaily along, sometimes walking alone, sometimes joining some other wayfarer, telling everyone that he was from Bordeaux, where he had been to see his parents and get cured of a sabre cut. As he passed through the town of Blois, Rupert suddenly came upon a group of horsemen. saluting as he passed, for in those days in France no one of inferior rank passed one of the upper classes without uncovering. He went steadily on.
"That is a proper-looking fellow,"
one of the party said, looking after him. "By Our Lady," exclaimed another, "I believe I have seen that head and shoulders before. Yes, I feel sure."
"Gentlemen, we have made a prize. Unless I am greatly mistaken, this is the villainous Englishman who, it is believed, aided that malapert young lady to escape."
In another moment Rupert was surrounded, his hat was knocked off, and the Duke de Carillon, for it was he, exclaimed in delight,
"I thought I could not be mistaken. It is himself."
Rupert attempted no resistance, for alone and on foot it would have been hopeless. The governor of the royal castle of Blois was one of the party, and Rupert found himself in another 10 minutes standing, with guards on each side of him, before a table in the governor's room, with the governor and the Duke de Carillon sitting as judges before him. "I have nothing to say," Rupert said quietly. "I escaped from Lille because I had been, as I deemed it, unworthily treated in Paris. I had withdrawn my parole and was therefore free to escape if I could. I did escape, but finding the frontier swarmed with French troops, I thought it safer to make for central France, where a wayfarer would not be looked upon as suspiciously as in the north. Here I am. I decline to answer any further questions. As to the lady of whom you question me, I rejoice to find by the drift of your questions that she has withdrawn herself from the persecution which she suffered, and has escaped being forced into marriage with a man she once described in my hearing as an ape in the costume of the day." "And that is all you will say, prisoner?" the governor asked, while the Duke de Carillon gave an exclamation of fury. "That is all, sir, and I would urge that as an English officer I am entitled to fair and honorable treatment, for although I might have been shot in the act of trying to escape from prison, it is the rule that an escaping prisoner caught afterwards, as I am, should have fair treatment, although his imprisonment should be stricter and more secure than before. As to the other matter, there cannot be, I'm assured, even a tittle of evidence to connect me with the event you mention. As far as I hear from you, I escaped on the 10th from Lille, which date is indeed accurate. 3 days later, Mademoiselle de Pignerol left Versailles. The connection between the two events does not appear in any way clear to me." "It may or may not be," the governor said. "However, my duty is clear, to keep you here in safe ward until I receive His Majesty's orders." 4 days later the royal order came. Rupert was to be taken to the dreaded fortress prison of Loches, a place from which not 1 in 100 of those who entered in ever came from alive. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of The Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marie Christian. The Cornet of Horse by G.A. Henty. Chapter 20. Loches. A British officer broke out from Lille. "Ah!" the governor of Loches said to himself as he glanced over the royal order. "Something else beyond that, I fancy. Prisoners of war who try to break prison are not sent to Loches. I suppose he has been in somebody's way very seriously. A fine young fellow, too. A really splendid fellow. A pity, really. However, it is not my business. Number 4 in the South Tower," he said, and Rupert was led away. Number 4 was a cell on the 3rd story of the South Tower. More than that, Rupert did not know. There was no looking out from the loopholes that admitted light, for they were boarded up on the outside. There was a fireplace, a table, a chair, and a bedstead. Twice a day a jailer entered with provisions. He made no reply to Rupert's questions, but shook his head when spoken to. For the first week, Rupert bore his imprisonment with cheerfulness, but the absolute silence, the absence of anything to break the dreary monotony, the probability that he might remain a prisoner all his life, was crushing even to the most active and energetic temperament. At the end of a month, the jailer made a motion for him to follow him. Ascending the stairs to a great height, they reached the platform on the top of the tower. Rupert was delighted with the sight of the sky and of the wide-spreading fields, even though the latter was covered with snow. For a half an hour he paced rapidly round and round the limited walk. Presently the jailer touched him and, pointing below, said, "Look." Rupert looked over the battlement and saw a little party issue from a small postern gate far below him, cross the broad fosse, and pause in an open space formed by an outlying work beyond. They bore with them a box. "A funeral?" Rupert asked. The man nodded. "They all go out at last," he said. "But unless they tell what they are wanted to tell, they go no other way." 5 minutes later, Rupert was again locked up in his cell, when he was, in the afternoon of the same day, visited by the governor, who asked if he would say where he had taken Mademoiselle Pigneroles. "You may as well answer," he said. "You will never go out alive unless you do." Rupert shook his head. "I do not admit that I know aught concerning the lady you name. But did I so, I should prefer death to betraying her." "Ay," the governor said, "you might do that, but death is very preferable to life at Loches." In a day or two, Rupert found himself again desponding. "This will not do," he said earnestly. "I must arouse myself. Let me think, what have I heard that prisoners do? In the first place, they try to escape, and some have escaped from places as difficult as Loches. Well, that is one thing to be thought very seriously about. In the next place, I have heard of their making pets of spiders and all sorts of things. Well, I may come to that, but at present I don't like spiders well enough to make pets of them. Besides, I don't see any spiders to make pets of. Then some prisoners have carved walls, but I have no taste for carving. I might keep my muscles in order and my health good by exercise with the chair and table. Get to hold them out at arm's length, lift the table with one hand, and so on. Yes, all sorts of exercise might be continued in that way, and the more I take exercise, the better I shall sleep at night and enjoy my meals. Yes, with nothing else to do, I might become almost a Samson here. There, now my whole time is marked out. Escape from prison and exercise. I'll try the last first, and then think over the other." For a long time Rupert worked away with his furniture until he had quite exhausted himself. Then, feeling happier and better than he had done since he was shut up, he began to think of plans of escape. The easiest way, of course, would be to knock down and gag the jailer, and to escape in the clothes. But this plan he put aside at once, as it was morally certain that he should be no nearer to his escape after reaching the courtyard of the prison than he was in the cell. There remained then the chimney, the loophole, and the solid wall. The chimney was the first to disappear from the calculation. Looking up it, Rupert saw that it was crossed by a dozen iron bars. The height, too, was very great, and even when at the top, the height was immense to descend to the fosse. The loophole was next examined. It was far too narrow to squeeze through, and was crossed by 3 sets of bars. The chance of widening the narrow loophole and removing the bars without detection was extreme. Besides, Rupert had a strong idea that the loophole looked into the courtyard. Finally, he came to the conclusion that if an escape was to be made, it must be by raising a flag of the floor, tunneling between his room and that underneath it, and working out through the solid wall. It would be a tremendous work, for the loophole showed him that the wall must be 10 feet thick. Still, as he said to himself, it will be at least something to do and to think about, and even if it takes 5 years and comes to nothing, it will have been useful. Thus resolved, Rupert went to work and labored steadily. His exercise with the chair and table succeeded admirably, and after 6 months he was able to perform feats of strength with them that surprised himself. With his scheme for escape he was less fortunate. Either his tools were faulty or the stones he had to work upon were too compact and well built. But beyond getting up the flag, making a hole below it in the hard cement which filled the space between the floor, large enough to bury a good-sized cat, Rupert achieved nothing. He had gone into prison in November. It was now August, and he was fast coming to the idea that Loches was not to be broken out of by the way in which he was attempting to do it. One circumstance gave him intense delight. Adele's hiding place had not been discovered. This he was sure of by the urgency with which the governor strove to extract from him the secret of her whereabouts. Their demands were, at the last meeting, mingled with threats, and Rupert felt that the governor had received stringent orders to wring the truth from him. So serious did these menaces become that Rupert ceased to labor at the floor of his cell, being assured that ere long some change or other would take place. He was not mistaken. One day the governor entered, attended as usual by the jailer and another official. "Sir," he said to Rupert, "we can no longer be trifled with. I have orders to obtain from you the name of the place to which you escorted the young lady you went off with. If you refuse to answer me, a different system to that which has hitherto been pursued will be adopted. You will be removed from this comfortable room and placed in the dungeons. Once there, you must either speak or die, for few men are robust enough to exist there for many weeks." "I am sorry, sir, but I have my duty to do. Will you speak, or will you change your room?" "I will change my room," Rupert said quietly. "I may die, but if by any chance I should ever see the light again, be assured that all Europe shall know how officers taken in war are treated by the King of France." The governor shrugged his shoulders, made a sign to the jailer, who opened the door, and as the governor left, 4 other warders entered the room. Rupert smiled. He knew that this display of force was occasioned by the fact that his jailer, entering his room suddenly, had several times caught him balancing the weighty table on his arm, or performing other feats which had astonished the Frenchman. The work at the cell wall had always been done at night. "I am ready to accompany you," Rupert said, and without another word followed his conductor downstairs. Arrived at a level with the yard, another door was unlocked, and the party descended down some stairs, where the cold dampness of the air struck a chill to Rupert's heart. Down some 40 feet, and then a door was unlocked, and Rupert saw his new abode. It was of about the same size as the last, but was altogether without furniture. In one corner, as he saw by the light of a lantern which the jailer carried, was a stone bench on which was a bundle of straw. The walls streamed with moisture, and in some places the water stood in shallow pools on the floor. The dungeon was some 12 feet high. 8 feet from the ground was a narrow loophole, 18 inches in height and about 3 inches wide. The jailer placed a pitcher of water and a piece of bread on the bench, and then without a word the party left. Rupert sat quiet on the bench for an hour or two before his eyes became sufficiently accustomed to the darkness to see anything, for but the feeblest ray of light made its way through so small a loophole in a wall of such immense thickness. "The governor was right," he muttered to himself. "A month or 2 of this place would kill a dog." It was not until the next day that the jailer made his appearance. He was not the same who had hitherto attended him, but a powerful-looking ruffian, who was evidently under no orders as to silence such as those which had governed the conduct of the other. "Well," he began, "and how does your worship like your new palace?" "It is hardly cheerful," Rupert said, "but I do not know that palaces are ever particularly cheerful." "You are a fine fellow," the jailer said, looking at Rupert by the light of his lantern. "I noted you yesterday as you came down, and I thought it a pity then that you would not say what they wanted you to. I don't know what it is, and don't want to, but when a prisoner comes down here, it is always because they want to get something out of him, or they want to finish with him for good and all. You see, you are below the level of the moat here. The water comes at ordinary times to within 6 inches of that slit up there, and in wet weather it happens sometimes that the stream which feeds the moat swells, and if it has been forgotten to open the sluice gates of the moat, it will rise 10 feet before morning. I once knew a prisoner drowned in the cell above this." "Well," Rupert said calmly, "after all, one may as well be drowned as die by inches. I don't owe you any ill will, but I should be almost glad if I did, for then I should dash your brains out against the wall and fight till they had to bring soldiers down to kill me." The man gave a surly growl. "I have my knife," he said. "Just so," Rupert answered. "And it may be, although I do not think it likely, that you might kill me before I knocked your brains out. But that would be just what I should like. I repeat, it is only because I have no ill will toward you that I don't at once begin a struggle which would end in my death one way or another." The jailer said no more, but it was clear that Rupert's words had in no slight degree impressed him, for he was on all his future visits as civil as it was within his nature to be. "Whenever you wish to see the governor, he will come to you," he said to Rupert one day. "If the governor does not come till I send for him," Rupert answered, "he will never come." Even in this dungeon, where escape seemed hopeless, Rupert determined to do his best to keep life and strength together. Nothing but the death of the king seemed likely to bring relief, and that event might be many years distant. When it took place, his old friend would, he was sure, endeavor in every way to find out where he was confined, and to obtain his release. At any rate, he determined to live as long as he could, and he kept up his spirits by singing scraps of old songs, and his strength by such gymnastic exercises as he could carry out without the aid of any movable article. At first he struck out his arms as if fighting, so many hundred of times. Then he took to walking on his hands, and at last he loosened one of the stones which formed the top of the bed and invented all sorts of exercises with it. "What is the day in the month?" he said one day to his jailer. "It is the 15th of October." "It is very dark," Rupert said, "darker than usual." "It is raining," the jailer said, "raining tremendously." Late that night Rupert was awoke by the splashing of water. He leapt to his feet. The cell was already a foot deep in water. "Ha!" he exclaimed. "It is one thing or the other now." Rupert had been hoping for a flood. It might bring death, but he thought that it was possible that it might bring deliverance. The top of the loophole was some 2.5 feet from the vaulted roof. The top of the door was about on the same level, or some 6 inches lower. The roof arched some 3 feet above the point whence it sprang. Rupert had thought it all over, and concluded that it was possible, nay, almost certain, that even should the water outside rise 10 feet above the level of his roof, sufficient air would be pent up there to prevent the water from rising inside, and to supply him with sufficient to breathe for many hours. He was more afraid of the effects of cold than of being drowned. He felt that in a flood in October the water was likely to be fairly warm, and he congratulated himself that it was now, instead of in December, that he should have to pass through the ordeal. Before commencing the struggle, he kneeled for some time in prayer on his bed, and then, with a firm heart, rose to his feet and awaited the rising of the water. This was rapid indeed. It was already 2 feet over his bed, and minute by minute it rose higher. When it reached his chin, which it did in less than a quarter of an hour from the time when he had first awoke, he swam across to the loophole, which was now but a few inches above the water, and through which a stream of water still poured. Impossible as it was for any human being to get through the narrow slit, an iron bar had been placed across it. Of this Rupert took hold, and remained quiescent as the water mounted higher and higher. Presently it rose above the top of the loophole, and Rupert now watched anxiously how fast it ran. Floating on his back and keeping a finger at the water level against the wall, he could feel that the water still rose. It seemed to him that the rise was slower and slower, and at last his finger remained against a point in the stones for some minutes without moving. The rise of the water inside the dungeon had ceased. That it continued outside, he guessed, by a slight but distinct feeling of pressure in the air, showing that the column of water outside was compressing it. He had no fear of any bad consequences from this source, as even a height of 12 feet of water outside would not give any unbearable pressure. He was more afraid that he himself would exhaust the air, but he believed that there would be sufficient. And as he knew that the less he exerted himself, the less air he required, he floated quietly on his back, with his feet resting on the bar across the loophole, now 2 feet under water. He scarcely felt the water cold. The rain had come from a warm quarter, and the temperature of the water was actually higher than that of the cold and humid dungeon. Hour after hour passed. The night appeared interminable. From time to time Rupert dived so as to look through the loophole, and at last was rewarded by seeing a faint dull light. Day was beginning, and Rupert had no doubt that with early morning the sluices would be opened, and the moat entirely cleared of water. He had, when talking with his jailer one day, asked him how they got rid of the water in the dungeon after a flood, and the man said that there were pipes from the floor of each dungeon into the moat. At ordinary times these pipes were closed by wooden plugs, as the water outside was far above the floor, but that after a flood the water was entirely let out of the moat, and the plugs removed from the pipes, which thus emptied the dungeons. From the way in which the fellow described the various arrangements, Rupert had little doubt that the sluice gates were at times purposely left closed, in order to clear off troublesome prisoners, who might otherwise have remained a care and expense to the state for years to come. Long as the night had seemed, it seemed even longer before Rupert felt that the water was sinking. He knew that after the upper sluice had opened, the fosse might take some time to fall to the level of the water inside the dungeon, and that until it did, the water inside would remain stationary. He passed the hours by changing his position as much as possible. Sometimes he swam round and round, at other times he trod water, then he would float quietly, then cling to the bar of the loophole. The descent of the water came upon him at last as a surprise. He was swimming round and had not for some time touched the wall, when suddenly a ray of light flashed in his face. He gave a cry of joy. The water had fallen below the top of the loophole, and swimming up to it, he could see across the fosse and watch the sunlight sparkling on the water. It was 2 months since he had seen the light, and the feeling of joy overpowered him more than the danger he had faced. Rapidly the water fell until it was level with the bottom of the loophole. Then hours passed away, for the fosse would have to be emptied before the drain leading from the dungeon could be opened. However, Rupert hardly felt the time long. With his hands on the bar and in the loophole, he remained gazing out at the sunlight. The water in the fosse sank and sank, until he could no longer see it. But he could see the sun glistening on the wet grass of the bank, and he was satisfied. At last he was conscious of a strain on his arm, and withdrawing his gaze from without, he saw that the water had fallen 6 inches. It now sank rapidly, and in an hour he could stand with his head above it. Then he was able to sit down on his bed, but when the water sank to a depth of 2 feet, he again lay on his back and floated. He knew that a thick deposit of mud would be left, and that it was essential for his plan that he should drift to the exit hole of the water, and there be found with mud and slime undisturbed by footsteps or movement. Another 10 minutes and he lay on his back on the ground in a corner of the dungeon to which the water had floated him, having taken care towards the end to sink his head so that his hair floated partly over it, and as the water drained off remained so. He guessed it to be about midday, and he expected to be left undisturbed until night. After a time he slept, and when he awoke it was dark, and soon after he heard steps coming down the stairs. Now was the moment of trial. Presently the door opened and 4 of the jailers came in. They bore between them a stretcher. "This is the 5th," one said, and he recognized the voice of his own attendant. "It is a pity. He was a fine fellow. Well, there's one more and then the job's done." He bent over Rupert, who ceased breathing. "He's the only one with his eyes closed. he said. "I expect there's someone would break her heart if she knew he was lying here. Well, lift him up, mates." The 2 months' imprisonment in the dungeon had done one good service for Rupert. The absence of light had blanched his face, and even had he been dead he could hardly have looked more white than he did. The long hours in the water had made his hands deadly cold, and the hair matted on his face added to the death-like aspect. "Put the stretcher on the ground and roll him over onto it," one of the men said. "I don't mind a dead man, but these are so clammy and slimy that they are horrible to touch. There, stand between him and the wall and put a foot under him. Roll him over. There, nothing could be better. Now then, off we go with him. The weight's more than twice as much as the others." Rupert lay with his face down on the stretcher and felt himself carried upstairs, then along several long passages, then through a door, and felt the fresh evening air. Now by the sound he knew that he was being carried over the bridge across the moat to the burying ground. Then the stretcher was laid down. "Now then, roll him over into the hole," one said, "and let us go back for the last. Peste! I am sick of this job, and shall need a bottle of eau de vie to put me straight again." One side of the stretcher was lifted, and Rupert was rolled over. The fall was not deep, some 3 or 4 feet only, and he fell on a soft mass whose nature he could well guess at. A minute later he heard the retreating footsteps of his jailers, and leaping from the grave stood a free man by its side. He knew that he was not only free, but safe from any active pursuit, for he felt sure that the jailers, when they returned with their last load, would throw it in and fill up the grave, and that no suspicion that it contained one short of the number would arise. This in itself was an immense advantage to him, for on the escape of a prisoner from Loches, an event which had happened but once or twice in its records, a gun was fired and the whole country turned out in pursuit of the prisoner. Rupert paused for 2 minutes before commencing his flight, and kneeling down, thanked God for his escape. Then he climbed the low ramparts, dropped beyond them, and struck across country. The exercise soon sent the blood dancing through his hands again, and by the morning he was 35 miles from Loches. He had stopped once, a mile or 2 after starting, when he came to a stream. Into this he had waded, and had washed the muck stains from his clothes, hair, and face. With the morning dawn his clothes were dry, and he presented to the eye an aspect similar to that which he wore when captured at Blois nearly a year before, of a dilapidated and broken-down soldier, for he had retained in prison the clothes he wore when captured, but they had become infinitely more dingy from the wear and tear of prison, and the soaking had destroyed all vestige of color. Presently he came to a mill by a stream. "Hello!" the miller said cheerily from his door. "You seem to have been in the wars, friend." "I have in my way," Rupert said. "I was wounded in Flanders. I have been home to Bordeaux and got cured again. I started for the army again, and some tramps who slept in the same room with me robbed me of my last shilling. To complete my disaster, last night, not having money to pay for a bed, I tramped on, fell into a stream, and was nearly drowned." "Come in," said the miller. "Wife, here is a poor fellow out of luck. Give him a bowl of hot milk and some bread." End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of The Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark Leader. The Cornet of Horse by G. A. Henty, Chapter 21. Back in Harness. "You must have had a bad time of it," the miller said, as he watched Rupert eating his breakfast. "I don't know that I ever saw anyone so white as you are, and yet you look strong, too." "I am strong," Rupert said, "but I had an attack, and all of my color went. It'll come back again soon, but I am only just out. You don't want a man, do you?" I'm strong and willing. I don't want to beg my way to the army, and I am ashamed of my clothes. There will be no fighting till the spring. I don't want high pay, just my food and enough to get me a suit of rough clothes and to keep me in bread and cheese as I go back." "From what part of France do you come?" the miller asked. "You don't speak French as people do hereabouts." "I come from Brittany," Rupert said, "but I learned to speak the Paris dialect there and have almost forgotten my own. I have been so long away." "Well, I'll speak to my wife," the miller said. "Our last hand went away 3 months since, and all the able-bodied men have been sent to the army. So I can do with you if my wife likes you." The miller's wife again came and inspected the wanderer, and declared that if he were not so white he would be well enough, but that such a color did not seem natural. Rupert answered her that it would soon go, and offered that if, at the end of a week, he did not begin to show signs of color coming, he would give up the job. The bargain was sealed. The miller supplied him with a pair of canvas trousers and a blouse. Rupert cut off his long hair and set to work as the miller's man. In a week, the miller's wife, as well as the miller himself, was delighted with him. His great strength, his willingness and cheeriness kept, as they said, the place alive, and the pallor of his face had so far worn off by the end of the week that the miller's wife was satisfied that he would, as he said, soon look like a human being and not like a walking corpse. The winter passed off quietly, and Rupert stood higher and higher in the liking of the worthy couple with whom he lived. The climax being reached when, in midwinter, a party of marauders, for at that time the wars of France and the distress of the people had filled the country with bands of men who set the laws at defiance, 5 in number, came to the mill and demanded money. The miller, who was not of a warlike disposition, would have given up all the earnings which he had stored away. But Rupert took down an old sword which hung over the fireplace, and sallying out, ran through the chief of the party, desperately wounded 2 others, and by sheer strength tossed the others into the mill stream, standing over them when they scrambled out, and forcing them to dig a grave and bury their dead captain and to carry off their wounded comrades. Thus, when the spring came, and Rupert said that he must be going, the regrets of the miller and his wife were deep, and by offer of higher pay they tried to get him to stay. Rupert, however, was, of course, unable to accede to their request, and was glad when they received a letter from a son in the army, saying that he'd been laid up with fever and had got his discharge and was just starting to settle with them at the mill. Saying goodbye to his kind employers, Rupert started with a stout suit of clothes, 50 francs in his pocket, and a document signed by the mayor of the parish to the effect that Antoine Duprat, miller's man, had been working through the winter at Havre and was now on his way to join his regiment with the army of Flanders. Determined to run no more risks if he could avoid it, he took a line which would avoid Paris and all other towns at which he had ever shown himself. Sometimes he tramped alone, more often with other soldiers who'd been during the winter on leave to recover from the effects of wounds or fevers. From their talk, Rupert learned with satisfaction that the campaign which he had missed had been very uneventful, and that no great battles had taken place. It was expected that the struggle that would begin in a few weeks would be a desperate one, both sides having made great efforts to place a predominating force in the field. As he had no idea of putting on the French uniform even for a day, Rupert resolved as he approached the army frontier to abandon his story that he was a soldier going to take his place in the ranks. When he reached Amiens, he found the streets encumbered with baggage wagons, taking up provisions and stores to the army. The drivers had all been pressed into the service. Going into a cabaret, he heard some young fellow lamenting bitterly that he'd been dragged away from home when he was in 3 weeks to have been married. Waiting until he left, Rupert followed him and told him that he'd heard what he had said and was ready to go as his substitute if he liked. For a minute or two the poor fellow could hardly believe his good fortune. But when he found that he was in earnest, he was delighted and hurried off to the contractor in charge of the train. Rupert stopping with him, by the way, to buy a blouse, in which he looked more fitted for the post. The contractor, seeing that Rupert was a far more powerful and useful-looking man than the driver whose place he offered to take, made no difficulty whatever, and in 5 minutes Rupert, with a metal plate with his number hung around his neck, was walking by the side of a heavily loaded team, while their late driver, with his papers of discharge in his pocket, had started for home almost wild with delight. For a month, Rupert worked backwards and forwards between the posts and the depots. As yet the Allies had not taken the field, and he knew that he should have no chance of crossing a wide belt of country patrolled in every direction by the French cavalry. At the end of that time, the infantry moved out from their quarters and took the field, and the Allied army advanced towards them. The French army, under Vendôme, numbered 100,000 men, while Marlborough, owing to the intrigues of his enemies at home and the dissensions of the Allies, was able to bring only 70,000 into the field. The French had correspondents in most of the towns in Flanders, where the rapacity of the Dutch had exasperated the people against their new masters and made them long for the return of the French. A plot was on foot to deliver Antwerp to the French, and Vendôme moved forward to take advantage of it. But Marlborough took post at Halle, and Vendôme halted his army at Soigny, 3 leagues distant. Considerable portions of each force moved much closer to each other, and lay watching each other across a valley but a mile wide. Rupert happened to be with the wagons taking ammunition up to the artillery in an advanced position, and determined, if possible, to seize the opportunity of rejoining his countrymen. A lane running between 2 high hedges led from the foot of the hill where he was standing directly across the valley, and Rupert, slipping away unnoticed, made the best of his way down the lane. When nearly half across the valley, the hedges ceased, and Rupert issued out into open fields. Hitherto, knowing that he had not been noticed, he had husbanded his breath and had only walked quickly, but as he came into the open he started at a run. He was already nearly halfway between the armies and reckoned that before any of the French cavalry could overtake him, he would be within reach of succor by his friends. A loud shout from behind him showed that he was seen, and looking round he saw that a French general officer, accompanied by another officer and a dragoon, were out in front of their lines reconnoitring the British position. They, seeing the fugitive, set spurs to their horses to cut him off. Rupert ran at the top of his speed and could hear a roar of encouragement from the troops in front. He was assured that there was no cavalry at this part of the lines, and that he must be overtaken long before he could get within the very short distance that then constituted musket range. Finding that escape was out of the question, he slackened his speed so as to leave himself breath for the conflict. He was armed only with a heavy stick. The younger officer, better mounted, and anxious to distinguish himself on so conspicuous an occasion, was the first to arrive. Rupert faced round. His cap had fallen off, and grasping the small end of a stick, he poised himself for the attack. The French officer drew rein with a sudden cry. "You!" he exclaimed. "You! What? Still alive?" "Yet no thanks to you, Monsieur le Duc," Rupert said bitterly. "Even Loches could not hold me." His companions were now close at hand, and with a cry of fury the Duke rode at Rupert. The latter gave the horse's nose a sharp blow as the Duke's sweeping blow descended. The animal reared suddenly, disconcerting the aim, and before its feet touched the ground, the heavy knob of Rupert's stick driven with the whole strength of his arm, struck the Duke on the forehead. At the same instant as the Duke fell, a lifeless mass, over the crupper, Rupert leaned to the other side of the horse, placing the animal between him and the other assailants as they swept down upon him. Before they could check their horses, he vaulted into the saddle and with an adroit wheel avoided the rush of the dragoon. The shouts of the armies, spectators of the singular combat, were now loud, and the two Frenchmen attacked Rupert furiously, one on each side. With no weapon but a stick, Rupert felt such a conflict to be hopeless, and with a spring as sudden as that with which he had mounted, he leapt to the ground, as the general on one side and the dragoon on the other cut at him at the same moment. The spring took him close to the horse of the latter, and before the amazed soldier could again strike, Rupert had vaulted onto the horse behind him. Then, using his immense strength, a strength brought to perfection by his exercise at Loches and his work in lifting sacks as a miller's man, he seized with both hands the French soldier by the belt, lifted him from the seat, and threw him backwards over his head, the man flying through the air some yards before he fell on the ground with a heavy crash. Driving his heels into the horse, he rode him straight at the French general, as the latter, who had dashed forward as Rupert unseated the trooper, came at him. Rupert received a severe cut on the left shoulder, but the impetus of the heavier horse and rider rolled the French officer and his horse onto the ground. Rupert shifted his seat into the saddle, leapt the fallen horse, and stooping down, seized the officer by his waist belt, lifted him from the ground as if he'd been a child, threw him across the horse in front of him, and galloped forward towards the Allied lines, amid a perfect roar of cheering, just as a British cavalry regiment rode out from between the infantry to check a body of French dragoons who were galloping up at full speed from their side. With a thundering cheer, the British regiment reined up as Rupert rode up to them, the French dragoons having halted when they saw that the struggle was over. "Why, as I live," shouted Colonel Forbes, "it's the little Cornet." "The little Cornet! The little Cornet!" shouted the soldiers, and waved their swords and cheered again and again in wild enthusiasm, as Colonel Forbes, Lauriston, Dillon, and the other officers pressed forward to greet their long-lost comrade. Before, however, a word of explanation could be uttered, an officer rode up. "The Duke of Marlborough wishes to see you," he said in French. "Will you take charge of this little officer, Colonel?" Rupert said, placing the French general, who was half suffocated by pressure, rage, and humiliation, on his feet again. "Now, sir," he said to the officer, "I am with you." The latter led the way to the spot where the Duke was sitting on horseback, surrounded by his staff, on rising ground 100 yards behind the infantry regiment. "My Lord Duke," Rupert said as he rode up, "I beg to report myself for duty." "Rupert Holiday!" exclaimed the Duke, astonished. "My dear boy, where do you come from, and where have you been? I thought I was looking at the deeds of some modern paladin, but now it's all accounted for. I wrote myself to Marshal Villeroy to ask tidings of you, and to know why you were not among the officers exchanged, and I was told that you had escaped from Lille and had never been heard of since." "He never heard of me, sir, but His Majesty of France could have given you further news. But the story is too long for telling you now. You must be anxious about your friends, Rupert. I heard from Colonel Holiday just before I left England, begging me to cause further inquiries to be made for you. He mentioned that your lady mother was in good health, but greatly grieving at your disappearance. Neither of them believed you to be dead, and were confident you would reappear. And now, who is the French officer you brought in?" "I don't know, sir," Rupert said, laughing. "There was no time for any formal introduction, and I made his acquaintance without asking his name." An officer was at once sent off to Colonel Forbes to inquire the name of the prisoner. "There's one of your assailants making off," the Duke said, and Rupert saw that the trooper had regained his feet and was limping slowly away. He fell light, Rupert said. He was no weight to speak of. The other officer is killed, I think, the Duke said, looking with the telescope. I fancy so, Rupert said dryly. I hit him rather hard. He was the Duke de Caroline, and as he had given much annoyance to a friend of mine, not to mention a serious act of disservice to myself, I must own that if I had to kill a Frenchman in order to escape, I could not have picked out one with whom I had so long an account to settle. The officer now rode back and reported that the prisoner was General Mouflet. A good cavalry officer, the Duke said. It's a useful capture. And now, Rupert, you will want to be with your friends. If we encamp here tonight, come in to me after it's dark and tell me what you've been doing. If not, come to me the first evening we halt. Rupert now rode back to his regiment, where he was again received with the greatest delight. The men had now dismounted, and Rupert, after a few cordial words with his brother officers, went off to find Hugh. He found the faithful fellow leaning against a tree, fairly crying with emotion and delight, and Rupert himself could not but shed tears of pleasure at his reunion with his attached friend. After a talk with Hugh, Rupert again returned to the officers, who were just sitting down to a dinner on the grass. After the meal was over, Rupert was called upon to relate his adventures. Some parts of his narrative were clear enough, but others were singularly confused and indistinct. The first parts were all satisfactory. Rupert's capture was accounted for. He said that in the person of the commanding officer, he met an old friend of Colonel Holiday, who took him to Paris and presented him at Versailles. Then the narrative became indistinct. He fell into disgrace. His friend was sent back to the army, and he was sent to Lille. But why was this, Rupert? Captain Dillon, for he was now a captain, asked. Did you call His Majesty out? Or did you kiss Madame de Maintenon? Or run away with a maid of honour? A dozen laughing suggestions were made, and then Rupert said gravely, There was an unfounded imputation that I was interfering with the plans which His Majesty had formed for the marriage of a lady and gentleman of the court. Rupert spoke so gravely that his brother officers saw that any joking here would be ill-timed. But sly winks were exchanged as Rupert, changing the subject, went on to recount his captivity at Lille. The story of his escape was listened to eagerly, and then Rupert made a long pause and coloured lightly. Several things of no importance then happened, he said, and as I was going through the streets of Blois— The streets of where? Colonel Forbes asked in astonishment. You escaped from Lille, just on the frontier. What on earth were you doing down at Blois, 100 miles south of Paris? Rupert paused again. I really cannot explain it, Colonel. I shall make a point of telling the Duke, and if he considers that I acted wrongly, I must bear his displeasure. But the matter is of no real importance, and does not greatly concern my adventures. Forgive me if I do not feel justified in telling it. All the rest is plain sailing. Again the narrative went on, and the surprise at hearing that Rupert had been confined at Loches, well known as a prison for dangerous political offenders, was only exceeded by that occasioned by the incidents of his escape therefrom. Rupert carried on his story to the point of the escape from the French, which they had just witnessed. There was a chorus of congratulations at his having gone safely through such great dangers, and Dillon remarked, It appears to me that you've been wasting your time and your gifts most amazingly. Here you've been absent just 2 years, and with the exception of a paltry marauder, you do not seem to have slain a single Frenchman, till you broke that officer's skull today. I think, my friends, that the least we can do is pass a formal vote of censure upon our comrade for such a grievous waste of his natural advantages. The only thing in his favour is that he seems to have been given up his whole attention to growing, and has got so prodigiously broad and big that now he has again joined us, he'll be able to make up for the otherwise sinful loss of time." A chorus of laughter greeted Dillon's proposal, and the merry group then broke up, and each went off to his duty. Rupert's first effort was to obtain such clothes as he would enable him to appear in his ranks without exciting laughter. Hugh told him that all his clothes and effects were in store at Liège, but indeed it was questionable whether any would be of use to him. He was not taller indeed than he was 2 years before, but he was broader by some inches than before. From the quartermaster he obtained a pair of jack boots, which had belonged to a trooper who had been killed in a skirmish 2 days before. And from the armourer he got a sword, cuirass, and pistols. As to riding breeches, there was no trouble, for several of the officers had garments which would fit him. But for a regimental coat, he could obtain nothing which was in any way large enough. Hugh was therefore dispatched to Halle to purchase a riding coat of the best fashion and largest size that he could find, and a hat as much as possible in conformity with those generally worn. An hour or two later, Lord Fairholme and Sir John Loveday rode over. The news of the singular fight on the ground between the armies, and of the reappearance of the famous little Cornet of the 5th Dragoons, having spread apace through the army. Joyous and hearty were the greetings, and after a while, the party being joined by Dillon, Rupert gave his 3 friends a full account of his adventures, omitting some of the particulars which he had not deemed it expedient to speak of in public. "I understand now," Lord Fairholme said, "the change on your face which struck me." "Is my face changed?" Rupert said. "It does not seem to me that I've changed in face a bit since I joined 6 years ago." "It is not in features, but in expression. You look good-tempered now, Rupert, even merry when you smile, but no man could make a mistake with you now. There is, when you are not speaking, a sort of intent look upon your face, intent and determined, the expression which seems to tell of great danger expected and faced. No man could have gone through that 2 months in the dungeon of Loches and come out unchanged. All the other dangers you've gone through, and you always seem to be getting into danger of some kind, were comparatively sharp and sudden, and a sudden peril, however great, may not leave a permanent mark. But the 2 months in that horrible den, from which no other man but yourself would deem escape possible, could not but change you. When you left us, although you were 20, you are in most things still a boy. There's nothing boyish about you now. It's the same material, but it's gone through the fire. You were good iron, very tough and strong, but you could be bent. Now, Rupert, you have been tried in the furnace and have come out steel." "You're very good to say so," Rupert said, smiling, "but I don't feel all that change which you speak of. I hope that I'm just as much up to a bit of fun as ever I was. At present I strike you perhaps as being more quiet, but you see I've hardly spoken to a soul for 18 months, and have got out of the way rather. All that I do feel is that I have gained greatly in strength, as that unfortunate French trooper found to his cost today. But there, the trumpets are sounding. It's too late for a battle today, so I suppose we've got a march before us." End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of The Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Adele Pooley. The Cornet of Horse by G.A. Henty. Chapter 22. Oudenarde. The trumpet call, which summoned Rupert and his friends to horse, was, as he suspected, an indication that there was a general movement of the troops in front. Vendôme had declined to attack the Allies in the position they had taken up, but had moved by his right to Braine-l'Alleud, a village close to the ground on which, more than 100 years later, Waterloo was fought, and whence he threatened alike Louvain and Brussels. Marlborough moved his army on a parallel line to Anderlecht. No sooner had he arrived there than he found that Vendôme was still moving toward his right, a proof that Louvain was really the object of the attack. Again, the Allied troops were set in motion, and all night, through torrents of rain, they tramped wearily along, until at daybreak they were in position at Parc, covering the fortress of Louvain. Vendôme, finding himself anticipated, fell back to Braine-l'Alleud without firing a shot. But though Marlborough had so far foiled the enemy, it was clear that he was not in a condition to take the offensive before the arrival of Prince Eugene, who would, he trusted, be able to come to his assistance, and for weeks the armies watched each other without movement. On the 4th of July, Vendôme suddenly marched from Braine-l'Alleud, intending to capture the fortress of Oudenarde. Small bodies of troops were sent off at the same time to Ghent and Bruges, whose inhabitants rose and admitted the French. Marlborough, seeing the danger which threatened the very important fortress of Oudenarde, sent orders to Lord Chandos, who commanded at Ath, to collect all the small garrisons in the neighbourhood and to throw himself into Oudenarde. This was done before Vendôme could reach the place, which was thus secured against a coup de main. Vendôme invested the fortress, brought up his siege train from Tournai, and moved toward Lessines with his main army to cover the siege. The loss of Ghent and Bruges, the annoyances he suffered from party attacks at home, and the failure of the Allies to furnish the promised contingents, so agitated Marlborough that he was seized with an attack of the fever. Fortunately, on the 7th of July, Prince Eugene arrived. Finding that his army could not be up in time, he had left them, and accompanied only by his personal staff, had ridden on to join Marlborough. The arrival of this able general and congenial spirit did much to restore Marlborough, and after a council with the prince, he determined to throw his army upon Vendôme's line of communications, and thus force him to fight with his face to Paris. At 2 in the morning of the 9th of July, the Allies broke up their camp and advanced in 4 great columns towards Lessines and the French frontier. By noon, the heads of the columns had reached Herfelingen, 14 miles from their starting point, and bridges were thrown across the Dender, and the next morning the army crossed, and then they stood between the French and their own frontier. Vendôme, greatly disconcerted at finding that his plans had all been destroyed, ordered his army to fall back to Gavre on the Scheldt, intending to cross below Oudenarde. Marlborough at once determined to press forward, so as to force on a battle, having the advantage of coming upon the enemy when engaged in a movement of retreat. Accordingly, at daybreak on the 11th, Colonel Cadogan, with the advance guard consisting of the whole of the cavalry and 12 battalions of infantry, pushed forward, and marched with all speed to the Scheldt, which they reached by 7 o'clock. Having thrown bridges across it, he marched to meet the enemy, his troops in battle array. The infantry opposite N, the cavalry extending to the left toward Schaken. Advancing strongly down the river in this order, Cadogan soon met the French advance guard under Biron, which was moving up from Gavre. In the fighting, the French had the advantage, retaining possession of N, and there awaiting the advance of the English. Meanwhile, Marlborough and Eugene, with the main body of the army, had reached the river, and were engaged in getting the troops across the narrow bridges, but as yet but a small portion of the forces had crossed. Seeing this, Vendôme determined to crush the British advanced guard with the whole weight of his army, and so halted his troops and formed order of battle. The country in which the Battle of Oudenarde was about to be fought is undulating, and cut up by several streams, with hedgerows, fields, and enclosures, altogether admirably adapted for an army fighting a defensive battle. The village of N lies about a mile below Oudenarde, and a quarter of a mile from the Scheldt. Through it flows a stream formed by the junction of the two rivulets. At a distance of about a mile from the Scheldt, and almost parallel with that river, runs the Norken, a considerable stream, which falls into the Scheldt below Gavre. Behind this river the ground rises into a high plateau, in which, at the commencement of the fight, the greater portion of the French army were posted. The appearance of the Colonel Cadogan with his advanced guard completely astonished the French generals. The Allies were known to have been 15 miles away on the preceding evening, and that a great army should march that distance, cross a great river, and be in readiness to fight a great battle was contrary to all their calculations of probabilities. The Duke of Burgundy wished to continue the march to Ghent. Marshal Vendôme pointed out that it was too late, and that although a country intersected with hedges was unfavourable ground for the army which possessed the larger masses of men, yet that a battle must be fought. This irresolution and dissension on the part of the French generals wasted time, and allowed the Allies to push large bodies of troops across the river unmolested. As fast as they got over, Marlborough formed them up near Bevere, a village a few hundred yards north of Oudenarde. Marlborough then prepared to take the offensive, and ordered Colonel Cadogan to retake N. 4 English battalions, under Colonel Sabine, crossed the stream and attacked the French forces in the village, consisting of 7 battalions under Pfeiffer, while the cavalry crossed the rivulets higher up and came down on the flank of the village. The result was 3 French battalions were surrounded and made prisoners, and the other 4 routed and dispersed. The French generals now saw that there was no longer possibility of avoiding a general action. Vendôme would have stood on the defensive, which, as he had the Norken with its steep and difficult ground in his front, was evidently the proper tactics to have pursued. He was, however, overruled by the Duke of Burgundy and the other generals, and the French accordingly descended from the plateau, crossed the Norken, and advanced to the attack. The armies were of nearly equal strength, the French having slightly the advantage. The Allies had 112 battalions and 180 squadrons, in all 80,000 men. The French 121 battalions and 198 squadrons, in all 85,000 men. The French again lost time and fell into confusion as they advanced, owing to Marshal Vendôme's orders being countermanded by the Duke of Burgundy, who had nominally the chief command, and who was jealous of Vendôme's reputation. Marlborough divined the cause of the hesitation, and perceiving that the main attack would be made on his left, which was posted in front of the castle of Bevere, half a mile from the village of the same name, ordered 12 battalions of infantry under Cadogan to move from his right at N to reinforce his left. He then lined all the hedges with infantry, and stationing 20 British battalions under Argyll with 4 guns in reserve, awaited the attack. But few guns were employed on either side during the battle, for artillery in those days moved but slowly, and the rapid movement of both armies had left the guns far behind. The French in their advance at once drew in 4 battalions, posted at Groenveld in advance of N, and then bearing to their right, pressed forward with such vigour that they drove back the Allied left. At this point were the Dutch and Hanoverian troops. Marlborough now dispatched Eugene to take command of the British on the right, directed Count Lotham to move from the centre with 20 battalions to reinforce that side of the fight, and went himself to restore the battle on the left. Eugene, with his British troops, were gradually but steadily, in spite of their obstinate resistance, being driven back, when Lotham's reinforcements arrived, and with these Eugene advanced at once and drove back the enemy. As these were in disorder, General Natzmer, at the head of the Prussian cuirassiers, charged them and drove them back, until he himself was fallen upon by the French horse guards in reserve, while the infantry's fire from the hedgerows mowed down the cuirassiers. So dreadful was the fire that half the Prussian cavalry were slain, and the rest escaped with difficulty, hotly pursued by the French household troops. An even more desperate conflict was all this time raging on the left. Here Marlborough placed himself at the head of the Dutch and Hanoverian battalions, and led them back against the French, who were advancing with shouts of victory, and desperate struggles ensued. Alison, in his history, says, "The ground on which the hostile lines met was so broken that the battle in that quarter turned almost into a series of partial conflicts, and even personal encounters. Every bridge, every ditch, every wood, every hamlet, every enclosure was obstinately contested, and so incessant was the roll of musketry, and so intermingled did the hostile lines become, that the field, seen from a distance, appeared an unbroken line of flame." A warmer fire, a more desperate series of combats, was never witnessed in modern warfare. It was in great part conducted hand to hand, like the battles of antiquity, of which Livy and Homer have left such graphic descriptions. The cavalry could not act, from the multitude of hedges and copses which intersected the theatre of conflict. Breast to breast, knee to knee, bayonet to bayonet, they maintained the fight on both sides with the most desperate resolution. If the resistance, however, was obstinate, the attack was no less vigorous, and at length the enthusiastic ardour of the French yielded to the steady valour of the Germans. Gradually they were driven back, literally at the bayonet's point, and at length, resisting at every point, they yielded all the ground they had won at the commencement of the action. So, gradually, they were pushed back as far as the village of Diepenbeck, where so stubborn a stand was made that the Allies could no longer advance. Overkirk had now got the rear of the army across the river, and the Duke, seeing that the hill of Uyker, which flanked the enemy's position, was unoccupied by them, directed the veteran general with his 20 Dutch and Danish battalions to advance and occupy it. Arrived there, he swung round the left of his line, and so pressed the French right, which was advanced beyond their outer bounds into the little plain of Diepenbeck. The Duke commanded Overkirk to press round still further to his left by the passes of Mullum and the mill of Royegem, by which the French sustained their communication with the force still on the plateau beyond the Norken, and Prince Eugene to further extend his right so as to encompass the mass of French crowded in the plain of Diepenbeck. The night was falling now, and the progress of the Allies on either flank could be seen by the flashes of fire. Vendôme, seeing the immense danger in which his right and centre were placed, endeavoured to bring up his left, hitherto intact, but the increasing darkness, the thick enclosures, and the determined resistance of Eugene's troops prevented him from carrying out his intention. So far were the British wings extended around the plain of Diepenbeck that they completely enclosed it, and Eugene's and Overkirk's men, meeting, fought fiercely, each believing the other to be French. The mistake was discovered, and to prevent any further mishap of this kind in the darkness, the whole army was ordered to halt where it was and wait till morning. Had the daylight lasted 2 hours longer, the whole of the French army would have been slain or taken prisoners. As it was, the greater portion made their way through the intervals of the Allied army around them, and fled to Ghent. Nevertheless, they lost 6,000 killed and wounded and 9,000 prisoners, while many thousands of the fugitives made for the French frontier. Thus the total loss to Vendôme exceeded 20,000 men, while the Allies lost in all 5,000. When morning broke, Marlborough dispatched 40 squadrons of horse in pursuit of the fugitives towards Ghent, sent off Count Lowton with 30 battalions and 50 squadrons to carry the strong lines which the enemy had constructed between Ypres and Warneton, and employed the rest of his force in collecting and tending the wounded of both armies. A few days later, the two armies, that of Eugene and that of the Duke of Berwick, which had been marching with all speed parallel to each other, came up and joined those of Marlborough and Vendôme respectively. The Duke of Berwick's corps was the more powerful, numbering 34 battalions and 55 squadrons, and this raised the Duke of Vendôme's army to over 110,000, and placed him again fairly on an equality with the Allies. Marlborough, having by his masterly movement forced Vendôme to fight with his face to Paris, and in his retreat to retire still farther from the frontier, now had France open to him, and his counsel was that the whole army should at once march for Paris, disregarding the fortresses, just as Wellington and Blücher did after Waterloo. He was, however, overruled, even Eugene considering such an attempt to be altogether too dangerous, with Vendôme's army, 110,000 strong, in the rear, and it must be admitted it would certainly have been a march altogether without a parallel. Finding that his colleagues would not consent to so daring and adventurous a march, Marlborough determined to enter France and lay siege to the immensely strong fortress of Lille. This was in itself a tremendous undertaking, for the fortifications of the town were considered the most formidable ever designed by Vauban. The citadel within the town was still stronger, and the garrison of 15,000 picked troops were commanded by Marshal Boufflers, one of the most skilful generals in the French army. To lay siege to such a fortress as this, while Vendôme, with his army of 110,000 men, lay ready to advance to its assistance, was an undertaking of the greatest magnitude. In most cases, the proper course to have taken would have been to advance against and defeat Vendôme before undertaking the siege of Lille. But the French general had entrenched his position with such skill that he could not be attacked, while he had moreover the advantage that if the Allies stood between him and France, he stood between them and their base, commanded the Scheldt and the canals from Holland, and was therefore in position to interfere greatly with the onerous operation of bringing up stores for the British army, and with the passage to the front of the immense siege train requisite for an operation of such magnitude as was now about to be undertaken, and for whose transport alone 16,000 horses were required. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of the Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cornet of Horse by G.A. Henty. Chapter 23. The Siege of Lille. The British cavalry suffered less severely at Oudenarde than did those of the other allied nationalities, as they were, during the greater portion of the day, held in reserve, and neither Rupert nor any of his special friends in the regiment were wounded. He was, however, greatly grieved at the death of Sir John Loveday, who was killed by a cannon ball at the commencement of the action. 2 of the captains in the 5th were also killed, and this gave Rupert another step. He could have had his captain's rank long before, had he accepted the Duke's offer, several times repeated, of a post on his staff. He preferred, however, the life with his regiment, and in this his promotion was, of course, regular, instead of going up by favour, as was and still is the case on the staff. The train for the Siege of Lille was brought up by canal from Holland to Brussels, and although the French knew that a large accumulation of military stores was taking place there, they could not believe that Marlborough meditated so gigantic an undertaking as the Siege of Lille, and believed that he was intending to lay siege to Mons. Berwick, with his army, which had since his arrival on the scene of action been lying at Douai, now advanced to Montagne, and Vendôme attached 18,000 men from his army, lying between Ghent and Bruges, to Malles, to intercept any convoy that might move out from Brussels. Marlborough's measures were, however, well taken. Eugene, with 25 battalions and 30 squadrons, moved parallel to the convoy, which was 15 miles in length, while the Prince of Württemberg, General Wood, the Prince of Orange, each with a large force, were so placed as to check any movement of the enemy. The gigantic convoy left Brussels on the 6th of August and reached the camp near Lille on the 15th without the loss of a single wagon. Prince Eugene, with 53 battalions and 90 squadrons, in all 40,000 men, undertook the siege, while Marlborough, with the main army of 60,000 men, took post at Haldon, where he alike prevented Berwick and Vendôme from effecting a junction, and covered the passage of convoys from Brussels, Ath, and Oudenarde. No less than 81 convoys with food, stores, etc. passed safely along, and the arrangements for their safety were so perfect that they excited the lively admiration both of friends and foes. Feuguière, the French annalist, asks, quote, "How was it possible to believe that it was in the power of the enemy to convey to Lille all that was necessary for the siege, and supplies of the army, to conduct there all the artillery and implements essential for such an undertaking, and that these immense burdens should be transported by land over a line of 23 leagues, under the eyes of an army of 80,000 men, lying on the flank of a prodigious convoy which extended over 5 leagues of road? Nevertheless, all that was done without a shot being fired or a chariot unharnessed. Posterity will scarcely believe it. Nevertheless, it was the simple truth." End quote. To facilitate his operations, Marlborough threw 6 bridges across the Scheldt, and 10,000 pioneers were collected to commence the lines which were to surround the city. The lines were projected not only to shut in the city, but to protect the besiegers from attacks by a relieving army. Never since Caesar besieged Alesia had works upon so gigantic a scale been constructed. They were 15 miles in circumference, and the ditch was 15 feet wide and 9 deep. On the 23rd of August, the lines of circumvallation now being nearly finished, Eugene opened his trenches and began operations against the city, the parts selected for attack being the gates of Saint-Martin and of the Madeleine. These points were upon the same side of the city, but were separated from each other by the river Dyle, which flows through the town. On the morning of the 24th, the cannonade opened, Prince Eugene himself firing the first gun on the right, the Prince of Orange that on the left attack. The troops worked with the greatest energy, and the next day 44 guns poured their fire into the advanced works around the chapel of the Madeleine, which stood outside the walls. The same night the chapel was carried by assault, but the next night, while a tremendous cannonade was going on, 400 French issued quietly from their works, fell upon the 200 Dutch who held the chapel, killed or drove them out, blew up the chapel, which served as an advanced post for the besiegers, and retired before reinforcements could arrive. Marshal Vendôme now determined to unite with the Duke of Berwick, and to raise the siege, and by making a long and circuitous march to avoid Marlborough's force. This was accomplished, the 2 armies united and advanced to relieve Lille. Marlborough, who foresaw the line by which they would approach, drew up his army in order of battle, with his right resting on the Dyle at Noyelles, and his left on the Marne at Péronne. 2 hours after he had taken up his position, the French army, 110,000 strong, the most imposing France had ever put in the field, appeared before him. The Duke of Marlborough had been strengthened by 10,000 men dispatched to him by Prince Eugene from the besieging army, but he had only 70,000 men to oppose to the French. And yet, notwithstanding their great superiority of numbers, the enemy did not venture to attack, and for a fortnight the armies remained facing each other without a blow being struck on either side. The French were, in fact, paralyzed by the jealousy of the two great generals commanding them, each of whom opposed the other's proposals, and nothing could be decided until the king sent Monsieur Chamillart, the French Minister of War, to examine the spot and give instructions for an attack. The 6 days, however, which elapsed between the appearance of the French army in front of Marlborough and the arrival of Monsieur Chamillart in camp, had given Marlborough time to entrench his position, that upon reconnoitring it, Chamillart, Vendôme, Berwick, and the other generals were unanimous in their opinion that it was too strong to be attacked. The great army therefore again retired, and taking up its post between Brussels and Lille, completely interrupted the arrival of further convoys or stores to the British camp. The siege meantime had been pressed hotly. From the 27th of August to the 7th of September, 120 cannon and 80 mortars thundered continuously, and on the evening of the 7th 2 breaches were effected in the side of the bastions of the outworks that were to be assaulted. 14,000 men prepared to storm the outworks. The French allowed them to get, with but slight resistance, into the covered way, where a terrific fire was poured upon them. 800 were shot down in a few minutes, and 2 mines were exploded under them. The fighting was desperate, but the assailants managed to retain possession of 2 points in the outwork, a success most dearly purchased with a loss of 2,000 killed and as many wounded. It was not until the 20th that a fresh attempt to carry the place by storm was made. At this time Marlborough's position was becoming critical. The fortress held out bravely. The consumption of ammunition was so enormous that his supplies were almost exhausted, and a great army lay directly upon his line of communication. It became a matter of necessity that the place should be taken. Immense efforts were made to secure the success of the assault. Enormous quantities of fascines were made for filling up the ditch, and 5,000 British troops were sent by Marlborough from his army to lead the assault. Rupert Holiday, with many other officers, accompanied this body as a volunteer. The troops were drawn up as the afternoon grew late, and just as it became dark they advanced to the assault. The besieged in the outworks assaulted were supported by the fire of the cannon and musketry of the ramparts behind, from which, so soon as the dense masses of the stormers advanced, a stream of flame issued. So tremendous was the carnage that 3 times the troops recoiled before the storm of balls. On the 4th occasion Eugene himself led them to the assault. On either side of him were the princes of Orange and Hesse, and a number of officers. "Remember Hochstadt, Ramillies, and Oudenarde," the prince shouted, but scarcely had he spoken when he was struck to the ground by a bullet, which struck and glanced over the left eye. Then the troops dashed forward and forced their way into the outwork. The French fought with magnificent resolution, and were from time to time reinforced by parties from the city. For 2 hours the fight raged. With bayonets and clubbed muskets, hand to hand the troops fought. No one flinched or gave way. Indeed, it was safer to be in the front line than behind, for in front friends and foes were so mixed together that the French on the ramparts were unable to fire, but had to direct their aim at the masses behind. At last the Allies gained ground. Gradually, foot by foot, the French were thrust back, and Rupert, who had been fighting desperately in the front line of the stormers' party, directed his efforts to a part where a French officer still held his ground, nobly backed by his men. The piled-up dead in front of them showed how strenuous had been the resistance to the advancing wave of the Allies. Rupert gradually reached the spot, and had no difficulty in placing himself vis-à-vis to the French officer, for so terrible was his skill that others willingly turned aside to attack less dangerous opponents. In a moment the swords crossed. The light was a strange one, flickering and yet constant, with the thousands of firearms which kept up an unceasing roar. The swords clashed and ground together, and after a pass or 2 both men drew back. A bright flash from a musket not a yard away threw a bright, though momentary, light on their faces. "Monsieur Dessein!" Rupert exclaimed in delight. "What! Is it possible?" the Frenchman exclaimed. "Rupert Holiday!" At the moment there was a tremendous rush of the British. The French were borne back and hurled over the edge of the outwork, and before Rupert could avert the blow, the butt end of a musket fell with great force upon his late opponent's head. Rupert leapt forward, and lifting him in his arms, made his way with him to the rear. For with that last rush the fight was over, and the Allies had established themselves in the left demi-bastion of the outwork, an important advantage, but one which had cost them 5,000 killed and wounded, of whom 3,000 belonged to the English force whom Marlborough had sent. The fact that more than half of them were hors de combat showed how fiercely they had fought. Owing to the wound of Prince Eugene, the Duke of Marlborough had to direct the operations of the siege as well as to command the army in the field. On the 23rd he followed up the advantage gained on the 20th by a fresh attack in 2 columns, each 5,000 strong, and headed by 500 English troops. After being 3 times repulsed, these succeeded in maintaining a lodgment in another outwork, losing, however, 1,000 men in the attack, the greater part being destroyed by the explosion of a mine. Both besiegers and besieged were now becoming straitened for ammunition, for the consumption had been immense. The French generals succeeded in passing a supply into the fortress in a very daring manner. On the night of the 28th, 2,500 horsemen set out from Douai, under the command of the Chevalier de Luxembourg, each having 40 pounds of powder in his valise. They arrived at the gate of the walls of circumvallation, when the Dutch sentry cried out, "Who comes there?" "Open, quickly," the leader answered in the same language. "I am closely pursued by the French." The sentry opened the gate, and the horsemen began to pass in. 1,800 had passed without suspicion being excited, when one of the officers, seeing that his men were not keeping close up, gave the command in French, "Close up! Close up!" The captain of the guard caught the words, and suspecting something, ordered the party to halt, and then, as they still rode in, ordered the guard to fire. The discharge set fire to 3 of the powder bags, and the explosion spreading from one to another, 60 men and horses were killed. The portion of the troops still outside the gate fled, but the 1,800 who had passed in rode forward through the Allied camp and entered the town in safety with 70,000 pounds of powder. Another deed of gallantry, equal to anything ever told in fiction, was performed by a Captain Dubois of the French army. It was a matter of the highest importance for the French generals to learn the exact state of things at Lille. Captain Dubois volunteered to enter the fortress by water. He accordingly left the French camp, and swimming through 7 canals, entered the Dial near the place where it entered the besiegers' lines. He then dived, and aided by the current swam under water for an incredibly long distance, so as entirely to elude the observation of the sentinels. He arrived in safety in the town, exhausted with his great exertions. After having had dry clothes put on him, and having taken some refreshment, he was conducted round the walls by Marshal Boufflers, who showed him all the defensive works, and explained to him the whole circumstances of the position. The next night he again set out by the Dial, carrying dispatches in an envelope of wax in his mouth, and after diving as before through the dangerous places, and running innumerable risks of detection, he arrived in safety in the French camp. But it was not the French alone who had run short of ammunition. Marlborough had also been greatly straitened, and there being now no possibility of getting through convoys from Brussels, he persuaded the home government to direct a considerable expedition which had been collected for the purpose of exciting an alarm on the coast of Normandy, and was now on board ship in the Downs, to be sent to Ostend. It arrived there, to the number of 14 battalions, and an abundant supply of ammunition, on the 23rd of September, and Marlborough detached 15,000 men from his army to protect the convoy on its way up. On the 27th of September the convoy started, crossed the canal of Nieuport at Leffingen, and directed its course by Slype to defile through the woods of Wynendael. General Webb, who commanded the troops detached for its protection, took post with 8,000 men to defend its passage through the wood, which was the most dangerous portion of the journey, while Cadogan with the rest of the force was stationed at Hoglid to cover the march further on. Vendôme had received information of the march of the column, and detached M. de la Motte with 20,000 men to intercept the convoy. At 5 in the evening the force approached the wood, through which the convoy was then filing. Webb posted his men in the bushes, and when the French, confident in the great superiority of numbers which they knew that they possessed, advanced boldly, they were received by such a terrible fire of musketry poured in at a distance of 100 yards that they fell into confusion. They, however, rallied and made desperate efforts to penetrate the wood, but they were over and over again driven back, and after 2 hours' fighting they retired, leaving the convoy to pass on in safety to the camp. In this action 8,000 English defeated 20,000 French, and inflicted on them a loss of 4,000 killed and wounded. Several fresh assaults were now made, and gradually the Allies won ground, until on the eve of the grand assault, Marshal Boufflers surrendered the town and retired with the survivors of the defenders into the citadel, which held out for another month and then also surrendered. In this memorable siege, the greatest, with the exception of that of Sebastopol, that has ever taken place in history, the Allies lost 3,632 men killed, 8,322 wounded, in all 11,954, and over 7,000 from sickness. Of the garrison, originally 15,000 strong, and reinforced by the 1,800 horsemen who made their way through the Allied camp, but 4,500 remained alive at the time of the final capitulation. Marshal Boufflers only surrendered the citadel on the express order of Louis XIV not to throw away any more lives of the brave men under him. At the time of the surrender the last flask of powder was exhausted, and the garrison had long been living on horseflesh. After Lille had fallen, Marlborough, by a feint of going into winter quarters, threw the French generals off their guard, and then by a rapid dash through their lines fell upon Ghent and Bruges, and recaptured those cities before Vendôme had time to collect and bring up his army to save them. Then ended one of the most remarkable campaigns in the annals of our own or any other history. End of chapter 23. Read by Sandra near Montreal, 2022. Chapter 24 of the Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cornet of Horse by G.A. Henty. Chapter 24. Adele. My dear, dear lad, the Marquis of Pignerol said as he made his way with Rupert back out of the throng in the captured outwork. What miracle is this? I heard that you had died at Loches. A mistake, as you see. Rupert laughed, but I shall tell you all presently. First, how is Mademoiselle? Well, I trust, the Marquis said, but I've not heard of her for 18 months. I've been a prisoner in the Bastille, and was only let out 2 months since, together with some other officers, in order to take part in the defence of Lille, even when I should not have been allowed to volunteer, had it not been that the Duke de Carolin, Adele's persecutor, was killed, and His Majesty's plans having been thus necessarily upset, he was for the time being less anxious to know what had become of Adele. In that case you have to thank me for your deliverance, Rupert said, for it was I who killed Monsieur le Duc, and never in my life did I strike a blow with a heartier good will. You! The Marquis exclaimed in astonishment. But I might have guessed it. I inquired about his death when I reached Lille, and was told by an officer who was there that he was killed in an extraordinary combat, in which General Mouflet, a trooper, and himself were put hors de combat in sight of the whole army, by a deserter of demoniacal strength, skill, and activity. I ought to have recognized you at once, and no doubt should have done so had I not heard that you were dead. I never was so shocked, dear boy, in all my life, and have done nothing but blame myself for allowing you to run so fearful a risk. On arriving at the camp, Rupert presented his prisoner to the Duke of Marlborough, who, having, when Rupert rejoined, heard the story of his discovery in the Marquis de Pignerol of his old friend, Monsieur Dessein, received him with great kindness and told him that he was free to go where he liked until arrangements could be made for his exchange. Rupert then took him to his tent, where they sat for many hours talking. Rupert learned that after his escape from Lille, the Marquis was for 3 weeks confined to his bed. Before the end of that time, a messenger brought him a letter from Adele, saying that she was well and comfortable. When he was able to travel, he repaired at once to Versailles, having received a peremptory order from the king a few days after Rupert left, to repair to the court the instant he could be moved. He found His Majesty in the worst of humours. The disappearance of Adele had thwarted his plan, and Louis XIV was not a man accustomed to be balked in his intentions. The news of Rupert's escape from Lille had further enraged him, as he connected it with Adele's disappearance, and the fact that the capture of Rupert had thrown no light upon Adele's hiding place had still further exasperated him. He now demanded that the Marquis should inform him instantly of her place of concealment. This command the Marquis had firmly declined to comply with. He admitted that he could guess where she would take refuge, but that as he sympathized with her in her objection to the match which His Majesty had been pleased to make for her, he must decline to say a word which could lead to her discovery. Upon leaving the king's presence, he was at once arrested and conveyed to the Bastille. Imprisonment in the Bastille, although rigorous, was not, except in exceptional cases, painful for men of rank. They were well fed and not uncomfortably lodged, and as the governor had been a personal friend of the Marquis previous to his confinement, he had been treated with as much lenity as possible. After he had been a year in prison, the governor came to his room and told him that Rupert had been drowned by the overflowing of the moat at Loches, and that if therefore his daughter was, as it was believed, actuated by an affection for the Englishman in refusing to accept the husband that the king had chosen for her, it was thought that she might now become obedient. He was therefore again ordered to name the place of her concealment. The Marquis replied that he was not aware that his daughter had any affection for Rupert, beyond the regard which an acquaintance of many years authorized, and that, as he was sure the news would in no way overcome her aversion to the match with the Duke de Carolan, he must still decline to name the place where he might suspect that she had hidden herself. He heard nothing more for some months, and then the governor told him privately that the Duke was dead, and that as it was thought that Lille would be besieged, 2 or 3 other officers in the Bastille had petitioned for leave to go to aid in the defence. Had the Duke still lived, the governor was sure that any such request on the part of the Marquis would have been refused. As it was, however, his known military skill and bravery would be so useful in the defence that it was possible that the king would now consent. The Marquis had therefore applied for, and had received, permission to go to aid in the defence of Lille. Rupert then told his story, which excited the wonder and admiration of the Marquis to the highest point. When he concluded, he said, "And now, Monsieur le Marquis, I must say what I have never said before, because until I travelled with her down to Poitiers I did not know what my own feelings really were. Then I learned to know that which I felt was not a mere brotherly affection, but a deep love. I know that neither in point of fortune nor in rank am I the equal of Mademoiselle, but I love her truly, sir, and the chase, which will some day be mine, will at least enable me to maintain her in comfort. Monsieur le Marquis, may I ask of you the hand of your daughter?" "You may indeed, my dear Rupert," the Marquis said warmly, taking his hand. "Even when in England the possibility that this might some day come about occurred to me, and although then I should have regretted Adele's marrying an Englishman, yet I saw in your character the making of a man to whom I could safely entrust her happiness. When we met again, I found that you had answered my expectation of you, and I should not have allowed so great an intimacy to spring up between you had I not been willing that she should, if she so wished it, marry you. I no longer wish her to settle in France. After what I've seen of your free England, the despotism of our kings and the feudal power of our nobles disgust me, and I foresee that sooner or later a terrible upheaval will take place. What Adele herself will say I do not know, but imagine that she will not be so obstinate in refusing to yield to the wishes of her father as she has been to the commands of her king. But she will not bring you a fortune, Rupert. If she marries you, her estates will assuredly be forfeited by the crown. They are so virtually now, Royal receivers have been placed in possession, but they will be formally declared forfeited on her marriage with you. However, she will not come to you a dowerless bride. In 7 years I have laid by sufficient to enable me to give her a dowry, which will add a few farms to the chase. And now, Rupert, let us to sleep. Day is breaking, and although your 23 years may need no rest, I like a few hours' sleep when I can get them. Upon the following day the conversation was renewed. I think, Rupert, that my captivity is really a fortunate one for our plans. So long as I remained in France, my every movement would be watched. I dared not even write to Adele, far less think of going to see her. Now I am out of sight of the creatures of Louis, and can do as I please. I have been thinking it over. I will cross to England. Thence I will make my way in a smuggler's craft to Nantes, where the governor is a friend of mine. From him I will get papers under an assumed name for myself and daughter, and with them journey to Poitiers, and so fetch her to England. You will let me go with you, will you not? Rupert exclaimed. No one can tell I'm not a Frenchman by my speech, and I might be useful. I don't know, Rupert. You might be useful, doubtless, but your size and strength render you remarkable. Well, but there are big Frenchmen as well as big Englishmen, Rupert said. If you travel as a merchant, I might very well go as your serving man, and you and I together could, I think, carry mademoiselle in safety through any odds. It will not be long to wait. I cannot leave until leave falls, but I'm sure the Duke will give me leave as soon as the Marshal surrenders the city, which cannot be very many days now, for it is clear that Vendôme will not fight, and a desperate resistance at the end would be a mere waste of life. So it was arranged, and shortly afterwards Rupert took his friend, Major Dillon, into his confidence. The latter expressed the wildest joy, shook Rupert's hand, patted him on the back, and absolutely shouted in his enthusiasm. Rupert was astonished at the excess of joy on his friend's part, and was mystified in the extreme when he wound up. "You've taken a great load off my mind, Rupert. You've made Pat Dillon even more eternally indebted to you than he was before." "What on earth do you mean, Dillon?" Rupert asked. "What is all this extraordinary delight about? I know I'm one of the luckiest fellows in the world, but why are you so overjoyed because I am in love?" "My dear Rupert, now I can tell you all about it. I told you, you know, that in the 2 winters you were away, I went, at the invitation of Mynheer Van Dyck, to Dort, in order that he might hear whether there was any news of you, and what I thought of your chance of being alive and all that, didn't I?" "Yes, you told me all that, Dillon, but what on earth has that got to do with it?" "Well, my boy, I stopped each time something like a month at Dort, and as a matter of course I fell over head and ears in love with Maria Van Dyck. I never said a word, though I thought she liked me well enough, but she was forever talking about you, and praising you, and her father spoke of you as his son, and I made sure it was all a settled thing between you, and thought what a sly dog you were never to have breathed a word to me of your good fortune. If you had never come back, I should have tried my luck with her. But when you turned up again, glad as I was to see you, Rupert, I made sure that there was an end of any little corner of hope I had had. When you told me about your gallivanting about France with a young lady, I thought for a moment that you might have been in love with her. But then I told myself that you were as good as married to Maria Van Dyck, and that the other was merely the daughter of your old friend, to whom you were bound to be civil. Now I know you are really in love with her, and not with Maria. I will try my luck there, that is, if she doesn't break her heart and die when she hears of the French girl." "Break her heart? Nonsense, man!" Rupert laughed. "She was 2 years older than I was, and looked upon me as a younger brother. Her father lamented that I was not older, but admitted that any idea of marriage between us was out of the question. But I don't know what he will say to your proposal to take her over to Ireland." "My proposal to take her over to Ireland?" repeated Dillon in astonishment. "I should as soon think of proposing to take her to the moon. Why, man, I've not an acre of ground in Ireland, nor a shilling in the world, except my pay. No, if she will have me, I'll settle down in Dort, and turn Dutchman, and wear big breeches, and take to being a merchant." Rupert burst into a roar of laughter. "You, a merchant, Pat! Mynheer van Dyck and Dillon. Why, man, you'd bring the house to ruin in a year. No, no. If Maria will have you, I shall be delighted, but her fortune will be ample without your efforts. You who, to my positive knowledge, could never keep your company's accounts without the aid of your sergeant. Dillon burst out laughing too. True for you, Rupert. Figures were never in my line, except it is such a neat figure as Maria has. Ah, Rupert, I always thought you a nice lad, but how you managed not to fall in love with her, though she was a year or so older than yourself, beats Pat Dillon entirely. Now, the sooner the campaign is over and the army goes into winter quarters, the better I shall be pleased. It was a dark and squally evening in November when La Belle Jeanne, one of the fastest luggers which carried on a contraband trade between England and France, ran up the river to Nantes. She had been chased for 12 hours by a British warship, but had at last fairly outsailed her pursuers and had run in without mishap. On her deck were 2 passengers, Maître Antoine Perrault, a merchant, who had been over to England to open relations with a large house who dealt in silks and cloths, and his servant Jacques Bontemps, whose sturdy frame and powerful limbs had created the admiration of the crew of the Belle Jeanne. An hour later the lugger was moored against the quay. Her crew had scattered to their homes, and the 2 travellers were housed in a quiet cabaret near, where they had called for a private room. Half an hour later, Maître Perrault left the house, inquired the way to the governor's residence, left a letter at the door, and then returned to the cabaret. At 9 o'clock a cloaked stranger was shown into the room. When the door was closed, he threw off his hat and cloak. "My dear Marquis, I am delighted to see you. But what means this wild freak of yours?" "I will tell you frankly, de Brissac." And the Marquis de Pignerol confided to the Count de Brissac his plan for getting his daughter away to England. "It is a matter for the Bastille of His Most Christian Majesty should he learn that I have aided you in carrying your daughter away. But I will risk it, Marquis, for our old friendship's sake. You want a passport saying that Maître Antoine Perrault, merchant of Nantes, with his servant Jacques Bontemps, is on his way to Poitiers to fetch his daughter, residing near that town, and that damsel will return with him to Nantes." "That is it, de Brissac. What a pity that it is not with us, as in England, where every man may travel where he lists without a soul asking him where he goes or why." "Ah, well, I don't know," said the Count, who had the usual aristocratic prejudice of a French noble of his time. "It may suit the islanders of whom you are so fond, Marquis, but I doubt whether it would do here. We should have plotters and conspirators going all over the country and stirring up the people." "Ah, yes, Count. But if the people had nothing to complain of, they would not listen to the conspirators. But there, I know we shall never agree about this. When the war is over, you must cross the Channel and see me there." "No, no," de Brissac said, laughing. "I love you, de Pignerol, but none of the fogs and mists of that chilly country for me. His Majesty will forgive you one of these days, and then we will meet at Versailles." "So be it," the Marquis said. "When Adele's estates have been bestowed upon one of his favourites, he will have no reason for keeping me in exile, but we shall see. You shall have your papers without fail tomorrow early, so you can safely make your preparations. And now good-bye, and may fortune attend you." It was not until noon next day that Maître Perrault and his servant rode out from Nantes, for they had had some trouble in obtaining 2 horses such as they required, but had at last succeeded in obtaining 2 animals of great strength and excellent breeding. The saddle of Maître Perrault had a pillion attached behind for a lady, but this was at present untenanted. Both travellers carried weapons, for in those days a journey across France was not without its perils. Discharged soldiers, escaped serfs, and others, banded together in the woods and wild parts of France, and although the governors of provinces did their best to preserve order, the force at their command was but small, as every man who could be raised was sent to the frontier, which the fall of Lille had opened to an invading army. Until they were well beyond Nantes, Rupert rode behind the Marquis, but when they reached the open country, he moved up alongside. "I do not know when I have enjoyed a week so much as the time we spent at the chase, Rupert. Your grandfather is a wonderful old man, as hard as iron, and your lady mother was most kind and cordial. She clearly bore no malice for my interference in her love affair some years ago." "Upon the contrary," Rupert said, "I am sure that she feels grateful to you for saving her from the consequences of her infatuation." 6 days later the travellers rode into Poitiers. They had met with no misadventure on the way. Once or twice they had met parties of rough fellows, but the determined bearing and evident strength of master and man had prevented any attempt at violence. The next morning they started early, and after 2 hours' riding approached the cottage where Adele had lived for 2 years with her old nurse. They dismounted at the door. "Go you in, sir," said Rupert. "I will hold the horses. Your daughter will naturally like best to meet you alone." The Marquis nodded, lifted the latch of the door, and went in. There was a pause, and then he heard a cry of "Father!" just as the door closed. In another instant it opened again, and Margot stole out, escaping to leave her mistress alone with her father. She ran down to the gate, looked at Rupert, and gave a little scream of pleasure, leaping and clapping her hands. "I said so, monsieur! I always said so! When Monsieur le Marquis comes, mademoiselle, you be sure Monsieur l'Anglais will come with him." "And what did mademoiselle used to say?" "Oh, she used to pretend she did not believe you would. But I knew better. I knew that when she said over and over again, 'Is my father never coming for me?' she was thinking of somebody else. And are you come to take her away?" Rupert nodded. The girl's face clouded. "Oh, how I shall miss her! But there, monsieur, the fact is... "You need not pretend to be shy," Rupert said, laughing. "I can guess what the fact is. I suppose that there is somebody in your case too, and that you're just waiting to be married till mademoiselle goes." Margot laughed and coloured and was going to speak when the door opened and the Marquis beckoned him in. "Mr. Holiday," he said, as Rupert, on entering, found Adele leaning on her father's shoulder with a rosy colour and a look of happiness upon her face. "I have laid my commands upon my daughter, Mademoiselle Adele de Pignerol, to receive you as her future husband, and I find no disposition whatever on her part to defy my authority, as she has that of His Majesty. There, my children, may you be happy together." So saying, he left the room and went to look after the horse, leaving Adele and Rupert to their newfound happiness. End of chapter 24. Read by Czandra, near Montreal, 2022.
Chapter 25 of the Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by the Countess. The Cornet of Horse by G.A. Henty, Chapter 25, Flight and Pursuit. It was early in the afternoon when Monsieur Perrot, with his daughter behind him on a pillion, and his servant riding at a short distance in the rear, rode under the gateway of Parthenay. A party of soldiers were at the gateway, and a gendarmerie officer stood near. The latter glanced carelessly at the passport, which the merchant showed him. The travellers rode on. "Peste!" one of the soldiers said. "What is Monsieur the Marquis de Pignerolles doing here, riding about dressed as a Borghese, with a young woman at his back?" "Which is the Marquis de Pignerolles?" one of the others said. "He who has just ridden by. He was the colonel of my regiment, and I know him as well as I do you." "It can't be him, Perry. I saw Louis Gordier yesterday. He has come home on leave. He belongs to this town. You know, Oudenarde. He was telling me about the siege, and he said that the Marquis was taken prisoner by the English." "Prisoner or not prisoner," the other said obstinately, "that is the Marquis. Why, man, do you think one could be mistaken at his own colonel? A good officer, too, rather strict perhaps, but a good soldier, and a lion to fight." The gendarme moved quietly away and repeated what he heard to his captain. "The Marquis de Pignerolles, travelling under the name of Monsieur Perrot, silk merchant of Nantes, with the young lady behind him," the officer exclaimed, "while he is supposed to be a prisoner in England. This must be his daughter, from whom we have made such a search 2 years ago, and who has been on our lists ever since. This is important, Andre. I will go at once to the prefecture and obtain an order for their arrest. They will be sure to put up at the Fleur de Lis. It is the only hostelry where they could find decent accommodation. Go at once, and keep an eye on them. There is no great hurry, for they will not think of going farther today, and the prefect will be at dinner just at present, and hates to be disturbed. The Marquise and Adele were standing over a blazing fire of logs in the best room of the Fleur de Lis, when Rupert, who was looking out of the casmented window, said, Monsieur le Marquise, I do not want to alarm you unnecessarily, but there is a gendarme on the other side of the street watching this house. He was standing by a group of soldiers at the gate when we rode through. I happened to notice him particularly. He is walking slowly, backwards and forwards. I saw him when I was at the door a quarter of an hour ago, and he is there still. And just now I saw him glance up at these windows. He is watching us. That is why I made an excuse to come up here, to ask you about the horses. Are you sure, Rupert? Quite sure, said Rupert gravely. Then there is no doubt about it, the Marquis said, for I know that you would not alarm us unnecessarily. What do you advise? I will go down, said Rupert, and put the saddles on quietly. The stable opens in the street behind. There is a flight of stairs at the end of the long passage there, which leads down into a passage below, at the end of which is a door into the stable yard. I have just been examining it. I should recommend Adele to put on her things, and to be in readiness, and then to remain in her room. If you keep watch there, you will see everyone coming down the street, and the moment you see an officer approaching, if you lock the door outside and take the key with you, then call Adele and come down the back stairs with her into the yard. I will have the horses in readiness. There's only one man in the stable. A crown piece will make him shut his eyes as we ride out, and they will be 5 minutes at the door before they find out that we have gone. The Marquis at once agreed to the plan, and Rupert went down into the stable yard and began to resaddle the horses. What? Off again? The ostler said. Yes, Rupert answered. Between you and I, my master just the creditor to whom he owes a heavy bill, and he wants to slip away quietly. Here's a crown for yourself, to keep your tongue between your teeth. Now let me have these saddles, and help bring them out quickly when I give the word. The horses resaddled and turned in their stables ready to be brought out without a moment's delay. Rupert took his place at the entrance, and watched the door leading from the hotel. In 10 minutes it opened, and the Marquise, followed by Adele, came out. Quick, with that horse, Rupert said to the ostler, and seeing to the other, they were in the yard as soon as the Marquise came up. An officer and 8 men, he whispered to Rupert as he leapt into the saddle, while Rupert lifted Adele onto the pillion. Mounted? No. Then we have a good half-hour's start. Which is the way to West Gate? Straight on, till you reach the wall, follow that to the right, it'll bring you to the gate. Rupert vaulted into his saddle, and the party rode out into the street, and then briskly, without any appearance of extraordinary haste, until they reached the gate. The guardian of the gate was sitting on a low block of wood, at the door of the guard-room. There was, Rupert saw, no soldier about. Indeed, the place was quiet, for the evening was falling, and but few people cared to be about in those times after nightfall. An idea flashed across Rupert's mind, and he rode up to the Marquise. Please lead my horse, he said. Wait for me 100 yards. I'll be with you in 3 minutes. Without waiting for an answer, he leapt from his horse, threw the reins to the Marquise, and ran back to the gate, which was but 30 yards back. A word with you, good man, he said, going straight into the guard-room. Hello, the man said, getting up and following him in. And who may you be? I should like to know who makes so free. Rupert, without a word, sprang upon the man and bore him to the ground. Then, seeing that there was an inner room, he lifted him and ran him in there, the man being too astonished to offer the slightest resistance. Then Rupert locked him in, and taking down the great key of the gate which hung over the fireplace, went out, closed the great gate of the town, locked it on the outside, and threw the key into the moat. Then he went off at a run and joined the Marquise, who, with Adele, was waiting anxiously at the distance he had asked. What have you been doing, Rupert? I have just locked the great gate and thrown the key into the moat, Rupert said. The gate is a solid one, and they will not get it open tonight. If they are to pursue us, they must go round to one of the other gates, and then make a circuit to get into this road again. I've locked the porter up, and I don't suppose they will find out until they ride up, half an hour hence. They will try for another quarter of an hour to open the gate, and it will be another good half-hour's ride to get around by the road. So we have over 1 hour's start. Capital indeed, the Marquis said as they galloped forward. The dangers you have gone through have made you quick-witted indeed, Rupert. I see you have changed saddles. Yes, your horse has been carrying double all day, so I thought it better to give a turn to the other. It is fortunate that we have been making short journeys each day, and that our horses are comparatively fresh. Why did you come out by the west gate, Rupert? The north is our way. Yes, our direct way, Rupert said. But I was thinking it over while waiting for you. You see, with the start we have got in the good horses, we might have kept ahead of them for a day. But with one horse carrying double, there's no chance for us doing so for 80 miles. We must hide up somewhere to let the horses rest. They would make sure that we are going to take ship, and would be certain to send on straight to Nantes, so that we would be arrested when we arrive there. As it is, we can follow this road for 30 miles, as if going to La Rochelle, then strike up for 40 miles right across to Nantes. Well thought of indeed, Monsieur de Pignerol said. Adele, this future lord and master of yours is as long-headed as he is long-limbed. Adela laughed happily. The excitement in the fresh air and the brisk pace had raised her spirits, and with her father and lover to protect her, she had no fear of the danger that threatened them. No, Rupert said, supposing that we could keep on, but we cannot. The horses have done 25 miles today. They have had an hour and a half's rest, but we must not do more than as much farther, or we shall run the risk of knocking them up. So they rode on at a fast trot for 3 hours. Here's the little road to the right, Rupert said. Let us ride up there and stop at the first house we come to. It was a mere by-road, and, as once out of the main road, they were for the present safe from pursuit. They now suffered the horses to break into a walk. It was not until 2 miles had been passed that they came to a small farmhouse. Rupert dismounted and knocked at the door. "Who is there?" a voice shouted within. "Travelers who want shelter and are ready to pay well for it." "No, no," the voice said. "No travelers come along here, much less at this time of the night. Keep away. We are armed, I and my son, and it will be worse for you if you do not leave us alone. Look here, good man, we are what I say," Rupert said. "Open an upstairs casement and show a light, and you will see that we have a lady with us. We are but 2 men. Look out, I say. We will be well. We need shelter for the lady." The casement opened, and a long gun was first thrust out. Then a face appeared. The night was not a very dark one, and he was able to see the form of the horse and of a rider with a female figure behind him. So far assured, he brought a light and looked out again. The inspection was satisfactory, for he said, "I will open the door directly." Soon Adela was sitting before a fire bright with logs freshly thrown on. The horses, still saddled, were placed in a shed with an ample allowance of food. One of the sons, upon the promise of a handsome reward, started to go a mile down the road, with instructions to discharge his gun if he heard horsemen coming up it. In a quarter of an hour, Adela, thoroughly fatigued with her day's exertions, went down to lie in bed, ordinarily used by the farmer's daughter. The Marquis wrapped himself in his cloak, and lay down in front of the fire, while Rupert took the first watch outside. The night passed quietly, and at daybreak the next morning the party were again in their saddles. Their intention was to ride by cross lanes parallel to the main road, and to come into that road again when they felt sure that they were ahead of their pursuers, who, with riding nearly all night, would be certain to come to the conclusion that they were ahead of the fugitives, and begin to search for some signs of where they had left the road. They instructed their host to make no secret of their having been there, to tell the exact truth of their time, arrival, and departure, and to say that from their conversation that they were going south to La Rochelle. The windings of the country roads that they traversed added greatly to the length of the journey, and the Marquis proposed that they should strike at once across for Nantes. Rupert, however, begged him to continue the line they had chosen, and to show at least once at the La Rochelle road, so as to lead their pursuers to the conclusion that it was to that town that they were bound. In the middle of the day they halted for 2 hours at a farmhouse, and allowed their horses to rest and feed, then shifted the saddles again, for Rupert had, since starting in the morning, run the greater part of the way with his hand on the horse's saddle, so that the animal was quite fresh when they reached their first halting place. They then rode on and came down into the La Rochelle road at a spot near which they had heard that a wayside inn stood at which they could obtain refreshments. The instant they drew rein at the door, they saw from the face of the landlord that inquiries had been made for them. "You had better not dismount, sir. These fellows may play you some trick or other. I will bring some refreshments out and learn the news." So saying, Rupert leapt from his horse, took his pistols from their holsters and placed one in his belt, and having cocked the other, went up to the landlord. "Bring out 5 machetes of bread," he said, and a few bottles of your best wine, and tell me how long it is since the men have came here asking if you had seen us." "This morning about noon," the man said. "Two gendarmes came along, and a troop of soldiers passed an hour since. They came from Parthenay." "Did they say anything besides asking for us?" "Come, here's a Louise, to quicken your recollection." "They said to each other as they drank their wine that you could not have passed here yet, since you could not get fresh horses as they had done. Moreover, they said that the troops from every place on the road were out in search of you." "Call your man and bid him bring out quickly the things I have named," Rupert said. The man did so, and a lad, looking scared at the sight of Rupert's drawn pistol, brought out the wine and bread and 3 drinking horns. "How far is it to La Rochelle?" Rupert asked. 35 miles. "Are there any byroads by which we can make a detour so as to avoid this main road, and so come down either from north or south into the town?" The landlord gave some elaborate directions. "Good," Rupert said. Then he broke up 2 of the portions of bread and gave them to the horses, removing the bits from their mouth, and poured a bottle of wine down each of their throats, then bridled up and mounted, throwing 2 louis to the host, and saying, "We can trust you to be secret as to our having been here, can we not?" The landlord swore a great oath that he would say nothing of their having passed, and they then rode on. "That landlord had a rogue written on his face," Adele said. "Yes, indeed," Rupert said. "I warned me by this time he has sent off to the nearest post. Now we will take the first road to the north, and then make for Nantes. It is getting dark now, and we must not make more than another 10 miles. These poor brutes have gone 30 already." 2 hours further riding at an easy pace brought them to a village, where they were hospitably received at the house of a mayor of the place. The start was again made early. "We must do our best today," the Marquis said. "We have a 55-mile ride before us, and if the horses take us there, their work is done, so we can press them to their utmost. The troops will have been marching all night along the road on which the innkeeper has set them, but by this morning they will begin to suspect that they have been put on a false scent, and as likely as not will be sent to Nantes. We must be there first, if possible." The horses, however, tired by their long journeys on the 2 preceding days, flagged greatly during the last half of the journey, and it was late in the afternoon before they came in sight of the Nantes. At a slight rise, half a mile from the town, Rupert looked back along the straight, level road on which they had ridden the last few miles of the journey. "There's a body of men in the distance, Marquis. A troop of cavalry, I should say. They are a long way behind, 3 miles or so, and if they are in chase of us, their horses must be fagged. But in 25 minutes they will be here." They urged their weary steeds into a gallop as far as the town, and then rode quietly along the streets into an inn-yard. Here they dismounted in a leisurely way. "Take the horses round to the stable, run them down and give them food," the Marquis said to the ostler who came out. Then turning to the host, he said, "A sitting room with a good fire, 2 bedrooms for myself and my daughter, a bedroom for my servant. Prepare a meal at once, we have a friend to see before we enter." So saying, he turned with his daughter, as if to retrace his steps up the street, but on reaching the first side street, turned, and then by another street made his way down to the river, Rupert following closely behind. "There is La Bella Gini," the Marquis exclaimed. "That is fortunate. The captain said he should be returning in a week or 10 days, so I hope he has his cargo on board and will be open to make start at once." End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of the Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark Leader. The Cornet of Horse by G.A. Henty. Chapter 26. The Siege of Tournai. In a few minutes, they were alongside the lugger. "Maître Nicolet! Maître Nicolet!" the Marquis shouted. "Hola!" and a head showed up the companion. On seeing who it was, the speaker emerged. "It's you, Maître Perrault." "Have you your cargo on board?" "Every barrel," said the skipper. "We sail tomorrow morning." I will give you 250 louis if you will sail in 10 minutes, and as much more if you land us safely in England. Really? Really? It's a bargain. Hola, Pierre, Etienne. Two lads ran up from below. Run to the wine shops on the quay. Fetch the crew. Just whisper in their ears. Say I'm casting off, that no man must wait to say goodbye to his wife, and that each down in 5 minutes will have as many louis, and that in 10 I sail, if with only half the crew. Run! Run! The two boys set off at full speed. I fear 10 minutes will be impossible, Maître Perrault. But all that can be done shall. Is 10 absolutely necessary? 20 may do, Maître Nicolet. But if we are not off by that time, we shall not be able to go at all. You are pursued? Yes. In half an hour at latest, a troop of soldiers will be here after us. Maître Nicolet looked at the sky. There's wind enough when we once get well beyond the town, but unless we get a good start, they will overtake us in boats. Is it a state affair, Maître Perrault? For I own to you, I don't like running my head against the state. I'll tell you frankly, Captain. I am the Marquis de Pignerol. This is my daughter. The king wants her to marry a man she does not like, and I'm running away with her to save her from being shut up in a convent till she agrees. And this one, Maître Nicolet said, pointing to Rupert. That is the gentleman whom both I and my daughter like better than the king's choice. That's all right, Maître Nicolet said. There's no hanging matter in that. But look, sir, if you should be late, and they come up with us in boats or warn the forts at the entrance, mind, we cannot fight. You must send us all below with your swords and pistols, you see, and batten us down so that we shan't be responsible, else I could never show my face in a French port again. Ah, here come 4 of the men, yes, and 2 more after them. That's good. Now, he said, when the men came up, not a question, not a word. There's money, but it has to be earned. Now set to work, loosen the sails, and get all ready for casting off. In a quarter of an hour from the moment the party had reached the Belgian, 8 men had arrived, and although these were but half the crew, the captain, who had been throwing himself heart and soul in the work, declared that he would wait for no more. The last rope was thrown off, and the lugger dropped out into the stream. It was running rapidly out, and as the wind caught the sails, the Belgian began to move, standing down towards the sea. During the time the lugger had been prepared for sea, the passengers had remained below, so as not to attract the attention of the little crowd of sailors whom the sudden departure had assembled on the quay. But they now came up on deck. Scarcely were they in the middle of the stream and the sails had fairly gathered way on her, when Rupert exclaimed, "There they are!" as a party of horsemen rode down on the quay, now nearly a quarter of a mile away. Then a faint shout came across the water, followed by a musket shot, the ball splashing in the water a little way astern. The men looked at each other and at their captain. "Look here, lads, I'll tell you the truth about this matter, and I know that, as men of La Vendée, you will agree with me. This gentleman who crossed with us before is a noble, and the king wants this lady, his daughter, to marry a man she does not like. The father agrees with her, and he and her fiancé, this gentleman here, have run away with her to prevent her from being locked up. Now we are bound, as true Vendéans, to assist them. And besides, they're going to pay handsomely. Each of you will get 10 louis if we land them safe in England. But you know we cannot resist the law, So we must let these gentlemen with their swords and pistols drive us below, do you see? And then we shan't be responsible if Jean does not heave to when ordered. Now, let us make a bit of a scuffle, and will you fire a shot or two, gentlemen? They'll be watching us with glasses from the shore, and we'll see that we make a fight for it. The sailors entered into the spirit of the thing, and a mock fight took place. The Marquis and Rupert flashed their swords and fired their pistols, the crew being driven below, and the hatch put on above them. The fugitives had time to look around. 2 boats laden with soldiers had put out and were rowing after them. The Marquis took the helm. The wind is freshening, and I think it will be a gale before morning, Rupert. But they're gaining upon us. I fear they will overtake us. I don't think they will get on board if they do so, Rupert said. Had not Adele better sit down on deck under shelter of the bulwarks? For they keep on firing, and a chance shot might hit her. It's no more likely to hit me than Papa or you, Rupert. No more likely, my dear, her father said, but we must run the risk, and you need not. Besides, if we are anxious about you, we shall not be so well able to attend to what we have to do. Adele sat down by the bulwark, but presently said, If they come up close, Papa, I might take the helm if you show me which way to hold it. I could do it sitting down on the deck, and you could help Rupert keep them off. Your proposal is a very good one, Adele, and it pleases me much to see you so cool and steady. The bullets were now whistling past the lugger, sometimes striking her sails, sometimes with a sharp tap hitting her hull or mast. We may as well sit down out of sight till the time comes for fighting, Rupert, the Marquis said. Our standing up does no good, and only frightens this little girl. The firing ceased when they sat down, as it was clearly a waste of powder and ball continuing. Rupert from time to time looked over the stern. The first boat is not more than 50 yards behind, the other 30 or 40 behind it. They gain on us very slowly, but I think they'll catch us. Then we must do our best, Rupert. We have each our pistols, and I think we might begin to fire on the rowers. The pistols are not much good at that distance, sir. My idea is to let them come alongside, then I will heave that cask of water down into the boat, and there will be an end of it. That water cask, the Marquis said, that's an 18-gallon cask. It's as much as we can lift it, much less heave it through the air. I can do it, never fear, Rupert said. You forget my exercises at Loches, and as a miller's man. My only fear, he said in a low voice, is that they may shoot me as I come to the side with it. For that reason, we had better begin to fire. I don't want to kill any of them, but just to draw their fire. Then just as they come alongside, put a cap and a cloak on that stick and raise them suddenly. Any who are still loaded are sure to fire the instant it appears. The Marquis nodded, and they began to fire over the stern, just raising their heads and instantly lowering them. The boats again began to fire heavily. Not a man in the boats was hit, for neither of those in the lugger took aim. The men cheered and rowed lustily, and soon the boat was within 10 yards of the lugger, coming up to board at the side. Rupert went to the water barrel and rolled it to the bulwarks at the point towards which the boat was making. The Marquis stopped behind the bulwarks, a few paces distant, with the dummy. "Now," Rupert said, stooping over the barrel as the boat made a dash at the side. The Marquis lifted the dummy, and 5 or 6 muskets were simultaneously discharged. Then a cry of amazement and horror arose as Rupert, with the barrel poised above his head, reared himself above the bulwarks. He bent back to gain impetus, and then hurled the barrel into the boat as she came within a yard of the side of the lugger. There was a wild shout, a crash of timber, and in an instant the shattered boat was level with the water, and the men were holding on or swimming for their lives. A minute later the other boat was on the spot, and the men were at work picking up their comrades. By the time all were in, she was only an inch or two out of the water, and there was only room for 2 men to pull. And the last thing those on board the lugger saw of her in the gathering darkness, she was slowly making her way towards shore. Now that all immediate danger was at an end, the Marquis took the tiller, and Rupert lifted the hatchway. "The captain and 2 of the crew may come on deck, if they promise to behave well," he said. There was a shout of laughter, and all the sailors pressed up, eager to know how the pursuit had been shaken off. When Rupert told them simply that he had tossed one of the water barrels into one of the boats and staved it, the men refused to believe him, and it was not until he took one of the carronades, weighing some 500 weight, from its carriage and lifted it above his head as if to hurl it overboard, that their doubts were changed into astonishment. "I suppose our danger is not over, Captain?" the Marquis asked. "No, we have the forts at the mouth of the river to pass, but we shall be there before it's light. They will send off a horseman when they get back to the town, but they will not be there for some time, and the wind is rising fast. I hope we shall be through before they get news of what has taken place. In any case, at the speed we shall be going through the water in another hour or two, no rowboat could stop us. I think, Captain Nikolai, it would be as well for you to keep only as many men as you absolutely want on deck, so that you can say we only allowed 2 or 3 up, and kept watch over you with loaded pistols." "It would be better, perhaps," Maître Nicolet said. "There's sure to be a nice row about it, and it's always as well to have as few lies as possible to tell. Perhaps Mademoiselle would like to go below. My cabin is ready for her, and I have told the boy to get supper for us all." The captain's prediction about the rising wind was correct, and in another hour the Belle Jaune was tearing down the river at a rate of speed which, had the road from Nantes to the fort been so longer than by water, would have rendered the chance of any horseman arriving before it slight indeed. But the river was winding, and although they calculated that they had gained an hour and a half start, Captain Nikolai acknowledged that it would be a close thing. Long ere the forts were reached, Adele was fast asleep below, while her father and Rupert paced the deck anxiously. The night was not a dark one. The moon shone out at times, bright and clear between the hurrying clouds. "There are forts," Maître Nikolai said. "The prospect is hopeful, for I do not see a light." The hands were all ordered below as they neared the forts, Maître Nikolai himself taking the helm. All was dark and silent as they approached, and as La Belle Jaune swept past them like a shadow, and all was still, a sigh of relief burst from the Marquis and Rupert. 5 minutes later the wind brought down the sound of a drum. A rocket soared into the air, and a minute or 2 later lights appeared in every embouchure of the forts on both sides. "It has been a near thing," the Marquis said. "We've only won by 5 minutes." 3 minutes later came a flash, followed by the roar of a gun, and almost at the same moment a shot struck the water 50 yards ahead of them on their beam. "We are nearly a mile away already," the captain said. "It's 50 to 1 against their crippling us by this light, though they may knock some holes in our sails, and perhaps splinter our timbers a little. Ah, just what I thought. Here come the chasse-marée." And he pointed to 2 vessels which had lain close under the shadow of the forts, and which were now hoisting sail. "It's lucky that they are in there instead of cruising outside as usual. I suppose they saw the gale coming and ran in for a quiet night." The forts were now hard at work, and the balls fell thickly around. 1 or 2 went through the sails, but none touched her hull or spars, and in another 10 minutes she was so far away that the fort ceased firing. By this time, however, the Chasse Maree were under full sail and were rapidly following in pursuit. La Belle Jaune had, however, a start of fully a mile and a half. "How do those craft sail with yours?" Rupert asked. "In ordinary weather the Jaune could beat them, though they are fast boats. But they are heavier than we are and can carry their sail longer. Besides, our being underhanded is against us. It'll be a close race, monsieur. It will be too rough when we are fairly out for them to use their guns. But the best thing that can happen for us is that there may be an English cruiser not far off. I must have the hands up and take in some sail. She'll go just as fast, for she is too much on to be doing her best now we are in the open sea. Now, gentlemen, I advise you to lie down for an hour or two. I'll call you if they gain much upon us." It was morning before the voyagers awoke and made their way on deck. They looked round, but no sail was in sight, only an expanse of foaming sea and driving cloud. The captain was on deck. "I suspect they've given it up and run back," he said, "and no fools either. It's not weather for anyone to be out who has a choice in the matter. But the Jaune is a good sea-boat, and has been out in worse weather than this. Not but that it is a big gale, but it's from the north, and the land shelters us a bit. If it keeps on like this, I shall lie to a few hours. The sea will be tremendous when we get beyond Ushant." For 3 days the gale blew furiously, and the Jaune lay to. Then the storm broke, and the wind veered round to the south, and La Belle Jaune flew along on her way towards England. It was at a point on the Hampshire coast, near Lymington, that she was to run her cargo, and on the 5th day after leaving the river she was within sight of land. They lowered their sails and lay a few miles off land until nightfall, and then ran in again. 2 lights on the shore, one above the other, told that the coast was clear, and the boats were quickly lowered. The Marquis, who had come well provided with gold to meet all emergencies, handed over to Maître Nicolai £50 over the sum agreed on, and in a few minutes the travellers set foot on shore. 6 days later, a post-chaise brought them to the door of Winthorpe Chase, where Madame Holiday and the Colonel stood on the steps to welcome Rupert's future wife. The very day after their return, Rupert mooted to the Marquis the subject of an early marriage. But the latter said at once, "I must first take a place for Adele to be married from. Mademoiselle Adele de Pignerol must not be married like the daughter of a little bourgeois. Moreover, Rupert, it's already near the end of the year. In 3 months you will be setting out to join your regiment again. It would be cruel to Adele for you to marry her before the war is over, or until you at any rate have done with soldiering. You tell me that you've gone through enough, and that the next campaign shall be your last. At any rate, you can obtain a year's leave after 9 years of campaigning. So be it. When you return at the end of next year's campaign, you shall find all ready, and I will answer for it that Adele will not keep you waiting. It is but a fortnight since you were affianced to each other. You can well wait the year." And so it was arranged, for Rupert himself saw that it would be cruel to expose Adele to the risk of being made a widow after a few weeks only of married life. The winter passed very quietly and happily. The Marquis was always talking of taking a house, but Adele joined her voice with those of the others in saying that it would be cruel indeed for him to take her away from the chase until it was time for Rupert to start for the war again. In the middle of March, he received orders to join his regiment, as large numbers of recruits had been sent out and every officer was required at his post. During the winter of 1708, Marlborough had laboured strenuously to obtain a peace which would satisfy all parties. Louis offered great concessions, which the Duke urged strongly should be accepted. But the English and Dutch wanted terms so severe and humiliating that Louis would not accept them, and both sides prepared for a great final struggle. The King of France addressed an appeal to his people, telling them that he had offered to make the greatest possible sacrifices to obtain peace for them, but that the enemy demanded terms which would place France at their mercy. He therefore appealed to their patriotism to come forward to save the country. The people responded readily to the summons, and Marshal Villars took the field in the spring with 110,000 men, a force just equal to that of the Allies. The French had taken up a position of such extraordinary strength that it was hopeless for the Allies to attempt to attack. His left wing was covered by the stream of Roubaix, his center by the marsh of Cambrieux, his right by the canal between Douai and Lille, and this naturally strong position had been so strengthened by artificial inundations, ditches, abattis, and earthworks as to be practically impregnable. Marlborough and Eugene made, however, as if they would attack, and Villars called to him as many men as could be spared from the garrisons round. The Allies then, by a sudden night march, arrived before Tournai, and at once commenced its investment. Tournai was an immensely strong town, but its garrison was weak. The heavy artillery was brought up from Ghent, and on the 6th of July the approaches were commenced. And on the 29th of that month, the governor, finding that the Allies were gradually winning fort after fort, and that Villars made no movement to relieve him, surrendered the town and retired into the citadel, which was then besieged. This was one of the most terrible sieges ever undertaken, for not only were the fortifications enormously strong, but beneath each bastion and outwork, and far extending beyond them, an immense number of galleries had been driven from mines. At all times, soldiers, even the bravest, have found it difficult to withstand the panic brought about by the explosion of mines, and by that underground warfare in which bravery and strength were alike unavailing, and where the bravest as well as the most cowardly were liable at any moment to be blown into the air or smothered underground. The dangers of this service, at all times great, were immensely aggravated by the extraordinary pains taken by those who had constructed the fortifications to prepare for subterranean warfare by the construction of galleries. The miners frequently met underground, breaking into each other's galleries. Sometimes the troops, mistaking friend for foe, fought with each other. Sometimes whole companies entered mines by mistake at the very moment that they were primed for explosion. They were often drowned, suffocated with smoke, or buried alive. Sometimes scores were blown into the air. It was not surprising that even the hearts of the Allied troops were appalled at the new and extraordinary dangers which they had to face at the Siege of Tournai, and the bravest were indeed exposed to the greatest danger. The first to mount a breach, to effect a lodgment in an outwork, to enter a newly discovered mine, was sure to perish. First there was a low rumbling noise, then the earth heaved, and whole companies were scattered with a frightful explosion. On the 5th of August, a sally made by the besieged was bravely repulsed, and the besiegers, pressing closely upon them, effected a lodgment. But immediately a mine was sprung, and 150 men blown into the air. On the 20th, the besieged blew down a wall which overhung a sap, and 2 officers and 34 soldiers were killed. On the 23rd, a mine 60 feet long and 20 feet broad was discovered, just as a whole battalion of Hanoverian troops had taken up their place above it. All were congratulating themselves on the narrow escape, when a mine placed below that they had discovered exploded, burying all in the upper mine in the ruins. On the 25th, 300 men posted in a large mine which had been discovered were similarly destroyed by the explosion of another mine below it, and the same night 100 men posted in the ditch were killed by a wall being blown out upon them. In resisting the attack upon one side of the fortress only, 38 mines were sprung in 26 days, almost every one with fatal effect. It is no detriment to the courage of the troops to say that they shrank appalled before such sudden and terrible a mode of warfare. And Marlborough and Eugene in person visited the trenches and braved the dangers in order to encourage the men. At last, on the 3rd of September, the garrison, reduced to 3,000 men, surrendered and were permitted to march out with the honors of war and to return to France on the promise not to serve again. This siege cost the Allies 5,000 men. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of the Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Victoria Alice Bell. The Cornet of Horse by G. A. Henty. Chapter 27. Malplaquet and the End of the War. During all the time that the Allies had been employed upon the Siege of Tournai, Marshals Villars had labored to form an impregnable line of entrenchments, barring all farther advance. Marlborough, however, a day or two previously to the fall of Tournai, sent off the Prince of Hesse, Cassel, who by a rapid and most masterly march fell upon the French lines, at a part where the French had no expectation of there being an enemy within 30 miles of them. No opposition was made, and the prince marched rapidly to the plateau of Jemappes, invested Mons on the French side. The rest of the army followed. The effect caused throughout France, and indeed through Europe, by the success of this masterly movement was immense, and it was evident that a great battle was at hand. Villars moved his army rapidly. A detachment of Eugen's troops were left to watch Mons, and the allied army, 93,000 strong, advanced to meet them, and on the night of the 7th, bivouacked in a line 3 miles long, and 5 from that occupied by the French. Marshal Villars had with him 95,000 men. The forces, therefore, were as nearly as possible equal, but the Allies had 105 guns against 80 of the French. The position taken up by Villars was of great natural strength, being a plateau interspersed with woods and intersected with streams, and elevated from 150 to 200 feet above the meadowland of Trouville, across which their assailants must pass. Malplaquet stood on this plateau. On the slopes from the plateau to the plain, the woods were extremely thick, and the only access to the plateau for troops were 2 clearings cut through the woods, known as the Trois de Louvier and de la Noire. On the morning of the 8th, when the French definitely took up their position, Marlborough and Eugen were in favor of making an instant attack, before the French could add to the great natural strength of their position by entrenchments. The Dutch deputies, however, were altogether opposed to an assault on so formidable a front. Finally, a compromise was adopted. A compromise which, as is often the case, was the very worst course which could have been adopted. The army should neither fall back as the Dutch wished, nor attack at once as Marlborough desired. It was resolved not to abandon the siege of Mons, and to attack the enemy if they would not take the offensive, but to wait until St. Ghislain, which commanded a passage on the Jain, was taken, and until 26 battalions on the march from Tournai arrived. It was 2 days before these conditions were fulfilled, and Villars had used these 2 precious days in throwing up a series of immensely strong works. The heights he occupied formed a concave semicircle, enflating on all sides the little plain of Malplaquet, and this semicircle now bristled with redoubts, palisades, abattis, and stockades, while the 2 tourelles, or openings by which it was presumed that the Allies would endeavor to force an entrance, were so enfilade by cross batteries as to be well nigh unassailable. Half the French army by turns had labored ceaselessly at works during the 2 days which the cowardly follies of the Dutch deputies had given them, and the result was the works resembled rather the fortifications of a fortress than ordinary field works. Marlborough and Eugen had seen from hour to hour the progress of these formidable works, and resolved to mask their front attack by a strong demonstration on the enemy's rear. The troops coming up from Tournai under General Withers were not ordered to join the main army, but to cross the Jain at St. Ghislaine and to attack the extreme left of the enemy. At the farm of La Folie, Baron Schulenberg was to attack the left flank of the entrenchments in the wood of Tasnir, with 40 of Eugen's battalions supported by as many cannon, while Count Lutum was to attack the right flank of the wood with 22 battalions. The rest of the army was to attack in the front, but it was from Eugen's attack in the wood of Tasnir that success was chiefly hoped. At 3 o'clock on the morning of the 11th, the men were got under arms. Divine service was performed at the head of each regiment, and then the troops marched to the posts assigned to them in the attack. Both armies were confident, the French enthusiastic. The Allies relied on their unbroken series of victories. Never once since the war had begun had they suffered defeat, and with Eugen as well as Marlborough with them. They felt confident of their power to carry a position which, even to the eye of the least instructed soldier, was yet formidable in the extreme. The French were confident in being commanded by their best and most popular generals, Villars and Boufflers. They were strong in the enthusiasm which the king's appeal had communicated to the whole nation, and they considered it absolutely impossible for any enemy to carry the wonderful series of works which they had erected. At 7:30 all was ready, and the fog which had hitherto hung over the low ground cleared up, and the two armies came into view of each other, and the artillery on both sides opened a heavy fire. The whole line advanced, but the left was halted for a while Count Lutum, with his 22 battalions formed in 3 lines, attacked the right of the wood of Tasnir, and Schulenberg, with whom was Eugen himself, attacked their left. Without firing a single shot, Schulenberg's men marched through the storm of grape, which swept them until within 20 paces of the entrenchments, when the musketry fire of the French troops was so terrible that the attacking columns recoiled 200 yards, where they were steadied and brought back to the charge by the heroic efforts of Eugen, who exposed himself in front of the line. While this conflict was raging, some Austrian battalions which had formed the extreme right of Schulenberg's corps, but had been unable to advance owing to a deep marsh, stole round and pierced into the northeastern angle of the wood of Tasnir, and were soon in conflict with the French. Laudum's division had, with immense bravery, crossed a deep morass under a tremendous fire, and stormed a portion of entrenchments. But Villars, who was directly in rear, led on a fresh brigade, who drove back the assailants. Marlborough then charged at the head of Duvernier's cavalry, and some of Laudum's battalion again forced their way in. Meanwhile, Withers was quietly making his way through the wood from La Folie, and had made considerable progress before the French could muster in force at this point. As this threatened the rear of his front position, Villars fell back from the entrenchments in front of the wood and took up the second and far stronger position he had prepared on the high ground. On the left an even more desperate fight had been raging. The Prince of Orange commanded here. The prince was full of courage and impetuosity. The troops under him were Dutch, or auxiliaries in the Dutch pay, among them a Scotch brigade under the Marquis of Tullibaren. The corps advanced in the most gallant manner, the Scotch and Dutch rivaling each other in bravery. 2 lines of the enemy's entrenchments were carried at the bayonet, and had there been a reserve at hand, the battle would have been won at this point. But the prince had thrown his whole force into the attack, and his 40 battalions were opposed by 70 French battalions, while the assailants were swept by the fire from the high ground. Tullibardin and General Spau were killed, and the assailants fighting with extraordinary obstinacy, with a loss of 3,000 killed and twice as many wounded. The French sallied out to attack them, but the Prince of Hesse-Cassel charged them with his cavalry and drove them back into their works. The news of the terrible slaughter and repulse on the right brought Eugen and Marlborough from the centre and left, where all was going well. Reserves were brought up and the battle restored. News now came that Villars, alarmed at the progress made on his left by Withers, had withdrawn the Irish brigade and some other of his best troops from his centre, to drive back the Allies' right. Eugen galloped off with all haste to lead the right and hurry them forward, while Marlborough directed Lord Orkney to attack the weakened front centre with all his strength, and ordered the cavalry to follow on the heels of the infantry. The fight on the right was fierce indeed, for here Villars and Eugen alike led their men. Both were wounded, Villars in the knee. He refused to leave the field, but insisted on being placed in a chair where he could see the battle and cheer on his men. The agony he suffered, however, and the great loss of blood weakened him so that at last he fainted, the command devolving on Marshal Boufflers. Eugen was wounded in the head. In vain his staff pressed him to retire in order that the wound might be dressed.
"If I am to die here,"
he said,
"of what use to dress the wounds? If I survive, it will be time enough in the evening."
So with the blood streaming over his shoulders, he kept his place at the head of his troops, who, animated by his example and heroism, rushed forward with such impetuosity that the works were carried. In the centre an even more decisive advantage had been gained. Lord Orkney made the attack with such vigor that the entrenchments, weakened by the forces which had been withdrawn, were carried, and the horse, following close behind, broke through the openings of the works, and spread themselves over the plateau, cutting down the fugitives. The guns in the works were wheeled round, and opened a tremendous fire on the dense masses of the French drawn up behind other parts of the entrenchments. Thrown into confusion by the fire, the French began to waver, and Marlborough gave the order for the great battery of 40 guns in the allied centre to advance. These advanced up the hill, passed through the entrenchments, and opened fire right and left upon the French. Although the French still strove gallantly, the battle was now virtually over. The centre was pierced, the right turned, and Boufflers prepared to cover the necessary retreat with his cavalry. With 2,000 picked horsemen of the Royal Horse Guards, he charged the allied cavalry when scattered and blown by their pursuit, and drove them back, but was himself repulsed by the fire of Orkney's infantry and fell back, leaving half his force dead on the plain. Again and again Boufflers brought up fresh cavalry and executed the most desperate charges to cover the retreat of his infantry, who were now falling back along the whole line, as the Prince of Orange, benefiting by the confusion, had now carried the entrenchments on the French left. Boufflers formed his infantry into 3 great masses and fell back in good order in the direction of Beauvais. Such was the victory of Malplaquet. A victory indeed, but one at such cost that a few more such successes would have been ruin. The Allies had gained the French position, had driven the enemy from the field, and had prevented the raising of the siege of Mons, the great object of the French. But beyond that their advantage was slight, for the enemy retired in good order and were ready to have fought again, if attacked on the following day. The Allies captured 14 guns and 25 standards. The French carried off 32 standards, principally Dutch. The French lost 14,000 men in killed and wounded. The Allies fully 20,000. The French historians have done full justice to the extraordinary bravery of the Allied troops. One of their officers wrote after the battle, "Eugen and Marlborough ought to be well satisfied with us on that day, since up to that time they had not met with a residence worthy of them. They may now say with justice that nothing can stand before them, and indeed what should be able to stay the rapid progress of those heroes? If an army of 100,000 men of the best troops, strongly posted between 2 woods, trebly entrenched, and performing their duty as well as any brave men could do, were not able to stop them one day, will you not then own with me that they surpass all the heroes of former ages?" The siege of Mons was now undertaken, and after a month's gallant defence, fell, and the 2 armies they went into winter quarters. There remaining now only the fortress of Valenciennes, between the Allies and Paris. Rupert Holiday was not present with the army at the siege of Mons. He had distinguished himself greatly in the desperate cavalry fight which took place upon the plateau after the British infantry had forced their way in, more than once fighting, in front of his regiment. He had been cut off and surrounded when the Allied cavalry gave way before the valiant charge of the French cavalry. But each time his strength, his weight, and the skill with which he wielded the long, heavy sword he carried, enabled him to cut his way through the enemy's ranks, and to join his regiment. He had not, however, come off scatheless, having received several severe sabre cuts. Hugh had also been wounded, and Rupert readily obtained leave to retire to England to be cured of his wounds, the Duke of Marlborough raising him to the rank of colonel on the field of battle. He had, during the campaign, received many letters from Adele, which told him that the Marquise had taken a house. But to each inquiry that Rupert made as to its locality, she either did not answer the question at all or returned evasive answers. All he knew was that she was staying at the Chase, and that the Marquise was away, seeing to the renovation of his house. It was not until Rupert returned that he obtained the clue to this little mystery. The Marquise de Pignerolles had bought the How, formerly the property of Sir William Brownlow, and intended the estate as a dowry for Adele. The Picnerolles' estate was indeed very large, and 2 or 3 years of his savings were sufficient, not only to purchase the estate, but to add to and redecorate and refurnish the house. Madame Holiday handed over to Rupert the title deeds of the whole of the Winthrop estate owned by her, as the income from her savings was more than enough to maintain her at Winthrop Chase. One only condition the Marquise exacted with the dowry, which was that the combined estate should, after Rupert finally came into possession of the Chase, be known not as the How, but as Winthrop Chase. It was at Winthrop Chase, my dear Rupert, that you first knew and drew sword for Adele, and the name is dear to her as to you. It is only right that I should unite the 2 estates, since I prevent their union some 10 years ago. I am in treaty now for a small estate 2 miles on the other side of Derby, so that, until the king either forgives me or dies, I shall be near you. The wedding did not take place quite so soon as Rupert had hoped, for his wounds were more severe than he had at first been willing to allow, and it was not until the last week of the year that the wedding took place. For many years after the event, the marriage of Rupert Holiday with Mademoiselle de Picnerolles was talked of as the most brilliant event which had taken place in the county of Derby during the memory of man. The great Duke of Marlborough himself and his Duchess came down to be present at the ceremony. From Holland came over Major Dillon, and 4 or 5 others of the officers of the 5th Dragoons. Lord Fairholme was also there, and who was not the least welcome to Rupert of those assembled at the wedding. Hugh was still a private, for although he could long ere this have been a sergeant had he chosen, he had always refused promotion, as it would have removed him from service as Rupert's orderly. There was also present at the wedding a young Dutch lady engaged to be married to Major Dillon, and her father. Rupert had ridden over to say how glad he should be to see them at his marriage, but that he could not think of asking them to come so far. Mynheer van Duyck had written, however, to say that he and his daughter would certainly come, for that regarding Rupert as his son, it would be extraordinary indeed for him to be absent. And so they arrived at the Chase 2 days before the wedding, and on the morning before going to church he presented Rupert with a cheque which simply astounded the young soldier. At first, indeed, he absolutely refused to accept it. The merchant, however, insisted so strongly upon it, urging that his own wealth was so large that as he had only Maria to inherit it, it was really beyond his wants, or even his power to spend, and that he had, ever since Rupert saved Maria from the attempts of Sir Richard Fulk, which, but for him, must have succeeded, regarded him as his adopted son. Rupert saw that his refusal would really give pain, and therefore, with warm gratitude, he accepted the cheque, whose value exceeded that of the united estates of the How and the Chas. Maria brought a magnificent set of jewels for Adele, not indeed that that young lady in any way required them, for the Marquise had had all her mother's jewels, which were superb, reset for the occasion. They were married first at the Roman Catholic chapel at Derby, for Adele was, of course, a Catholic, and then at the church in the village of Winthrop, after which there was a great dinner and much rejoicing and festivity at it. Rupert Holiday went no more to the wars. He obtained leave to reside on his estate for a year. That year, 1710, little was done in Flanders. The Duke's enemies at home had now gained the upper hand, and he was hampered in every way. The Allies, saying that a change of government was imminent in England, and that the new party would in all probability make peace at any cost and leave them to themselves, carried on quiet negotiations with France, and so throughout the summer no great battle took place, although the Allies gained several material advantages. In the following year envy, intrigue, and a woman's spite conquered. Godolphin fell, and the new ministry hastened to make the most disgraceful peace recorded in the annals of the history of this country. By its allies of England were virtually deserted, and the fruits of 10 years of struggle and of victory for the most part abandoned. Marlborough refused to sign the disgraceful peace of Utrecht, and exiled and disgraced, lived quietly on the continent until the death of Anne, a living monument of national injustice. When George I ascended the throne, the hero was recalled, and remained the war minister of the country until within a year or two of his death, honored and loved by the people for whom he had done so much. There is little more to tell about Rupert Holiday. His grandfather lived until past 90 years of age, and Madame Holiday died suddenly a few weeks after her father-in-law. Rupert was now one of the largest landowners in the country and was one of the most popular men. The home farm round the Loches was held for generations by the parsons, for Hugh married not many months after his master. At the death of Louise, the Marquise de Pignerolles passed over again to France, and there, at least when England and France were at peace, Colonel Rupert Holiday and his wife paid him long visits. As his daughter had married a foreigner, she could not inherit the estates, which went to a distant relation. But at the death of the Marquis at a good old age he left a fortune to his daughter, which enabled her husband still further to extend his estates, had Rupert desired it. He could have been raised to the peerage, but he preferred remaining one of the wealthiest private gentlemen in England. From time to time they received visits from Major Dillon and his wife, both of whom were great favourites with the young Holidays. Between Rupert and Hugh, a real affection prevailed all through their lives, and the latter was never so happy as when the children first, and years after the grandchildren of Rupert and Adele came down to the farm to eat cake, drink syllabub, and listen to wonderful tales about the doings of the Cornet of Horse. End of chapter 27. End of The Cornet of Horse by G.A. Henty.